This happened when I was 25. I'm a female and I've been dating a guy for about a year. Things were going great, so he asked me to meet his parents. He invited me to have dinner at their family home. It was at his parents' house where something unimaginable happened. My boyfriend was from the countryside and his family still lives there. From where I lived, it took 3 hours to get there by car. When I finally got to meet them, my boyfriend's attitude towards me changed dramatically. It really surprised me. He was usually quite the gentleman, but in front of his parents he addressed me with such terms like you and oi. Just downright rude. He shouted at me using these words like he was commanding me or something. He had never treated me like this before, but since I was in his parents' home, I just put up with it and gave him the benefit of the doubt. I mean, what else could I have done? I didn't want to make a scene or embarrass him. I could see where he got it from. His dad was throwing his weight around and bossing everyone around. His father shouted some command at his mom when she was doing something not quite to his liking, and it was pretty harsh. I looked over at her and she just kept her head down and did as she was told, like this was totally normal. His family were giving off some seriously suspicious vibes. I was starting to really regret coming, and it was so awkward and intimidating. At dinner, his father stared at me and said, "When you get married, you live here." It caught me off guard. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a joke. It was a demand. I'd been waiting for my boyfriend to speak up for me, but he never did. So eventually I just said, "But I haven't made any decisions about that yet." His dad glared at me. He looked so angry and said, "If you marry my son, you'll live here. Got it?" And he shouted at me, aghast. I stared at my boyfriend, and he must have felt my eyes pleading with him for some sort of help or defense, but he was just as silent as his mother. It killed me when he looked at his father and just nodded. Now, more to the point, my boyfriend had never mentioned marriage to me before, so I was totally shocked by this, and to be honest, our relationship has had its rocky moments. They started speaking of specific dates for a wedding, and the pressure was starting to intensify. Later, after dinner, when I was alone with my boyfriend, I said, "Hey, I feel a bit sick and I want to go home. Something isn't quite right." He didn't say anything, so I decided to start gathering up my things to head home by myself. Just as I turned to leave, he grabbed my arm. "Are you running away?" He boomed. He had totally changed. It was like I didn't know him at all. He forced me back into his childhood bedroom, and he overpowered me. He shut the door on me and locked it. I beat on the door and screamed for someone to let me out. I was making so much noise, there was no way that no one else in the house wouldn't have heard me. Things got worse when I realized that I had left my phone on charge downstairs. I couldn't do anything. I literally was a prisoner, and I was stunned. After a while, the door unlocked and my psycho boyfriend's mom entered the room. I was pleased to see her. I thought that she had come to my aid, but my hopes were dashed instantly when she handed me some papers. "Sign this." It was a marriage certificate. "If you do, you can go," she said in a monotone voice. It was the real deal. "I won't sign that. I'll never marry him." "You think you can escape, do you? Well, go on. Try your best." She asked me to sign it again, and I told her where to go. She walked out of the room and locked the door again. I needed to stay calm. I was terrified, sure, but I needed to keep my composure if I had a chance of getting out. I decided to wait until it was the dead of night, and I turned all of the lights off in the room and kept as still as possible. Figured the window would be my best and only option for escape. I would just have to deal with getting an injury if it happened. I opened the window and managed to climb down into the porch roof silently. It truly was amazing. I walked the whole night through to reach the train station, fearing for my safety, looking over my shoulder for that crazy mother and father. Days and weeks passed after this incident. I got email after email from my boyfriend. "You think that's the last of us? You really think you can get away? We'll not forgive this." Because I was living on my own at the time, I was too terrified to go back to my apartment alone. I asked friends and relatives to let me stay with them. I pleaded with them. One friend who lived quite far from where I met my boyfriend allowed me to stay with them, and I felt safer. With the help of a lawyer and a support group, I achieved what he told me was impossible. I escaped from him and his family. I hear from friends and neighbors from my old life. They say that they have seen him hanging around my former apartment and my old hangouts. Even though I live miles and miles away from him now, I'm still worried that he'll find me or find a way to hurt my family. This happened about 10 years ago. I was attending a really terrible university. I was working 4 nights a week, and I could afford little more than dinner each day. Rent and gas money really killed me financially. I really needed a job to survive. This all happened before I was working. It was summer of my second year. It was one of the hottest days of the year. On days like that, I always went to study on campus to enjoy the free air conditioning. In the library, they have a bulletin board where anyone can post any personal adverts and all that kind of stuff. I often check the board because sometimes you could pick up some easy work. For example, you could do high school students who were looking for a tutor and that kind of thing. Other times there would be interesting advertisements too. Study a foreign language with me. I like the sense of community. You'd see stuff like that. When I approached the board that day, I saw the following advertisement. Cleaner wanted to help clean a room. 5,000 yen per half day. Please contact Tanaka. This was some good timing because I had just taken a test and was about to have a week off. 5,000 yen was a lot to me. It's about $45. That would get me back to my hometown for a couple of days, I thought. As soon as I got back to my dorm, I immediately called the number provided. Hey, I'd like to apply for that cleaning job you posted. The voice on the other end of the line responded, and it sounded slightly bewildered. Oh, right. What days can you work? I told him that I work for the full amount advertised. Can you start at 9 a.m. next Tuesday? I agreed, and he gave me the address. It sounded like a residential address, and I guessed by his voice that he was a man in his 30s, and he sounded a little sick over the phone. My first day of work arrived. The morning was hot, but the sky was free of clouds. When I arrived at Mr. Tanaka's house, I felt the breeze of his air conditioning, and I was worried that I was going to be working without one. I arrived 10 minutes early at 8:50 and rang the doorbell, and a man came and answered it. Right on time. Come in, he said. He was a bit awkward, not one for chatting, and he wouldn't look me in the eyes when we spoke. I took my shoes off and followed him into the house. After we introduced ourselves to one another, he explained what he needed. It was pretty easy stuff. Help with moving heavy things, trips to the garbage dump, and some other light cleaning work. I was shocked by the things he was throwing away. It may have been trash to him, but to a student like me, they were treasures. He must have seen me admiring these things because he said, "If you want to keep anything, it's yours." So I sorted some things into a sort of keep pile and can't remember exactly what they were. I think there were a couple of games, some books, maybe a dirty magazine too. We were cleaning the room at a decent pace. I was kind of enjoying it, to be honest. Before long, his room started to look really good. Maybe we'll call it a day here. I felt him suddenly look my way. It looked like he was pretending to think about it a bit longer, and then he said, "Yeah, that's enough for today." Because I had worked a lot longer than half a day, he doubled my pay. I couldn't believe my luck, and then he said, "Are you free tomorrow? For half a day?" I was over the moon to get another chance to make some easy money, so I agreed. I got on my bike with all my cool new stuff and told him that I was looking forward to working with him tomorrow morning. When I got to his place, I found the door open. I craned my head around the door and called out. He asked me to come in. He was grinning when I walked in. "I have your money here. I'll leave it in this envelope over here." He grabbed me by the hand and led me to another room. This was weird. His whole attitude seemed different. In this room, there was a walk-in closet. There was a heavy-looking suitcase, sort of like for travel. This thing's so heavy. I need your help to help me move it. This is how it's gonna work. I'll push from behind, and on my signal, I want you to pull as hard as you can. Is that okay? He hopped over the suitcase and went into the walk-in closet. I couldn't see him beyond all the jackets, shirts, and all that kind of stuff hanging up in there. After a while, Mr. Tanaka shouted, "Pull!" And as per his instructions, I pulled the suitcase as hard as I could. It weighed so much, but what in God's name did he have in there? I wondered. It must have weighed almost 60 kilos. It was moving little by little, dragging slowly across the wooden floor. There was a clattering sound, and suddenly the suitcase felt incredibly light. "Mr. Tanaka?" I called out over and over, but there was no response. What was this? Some sort of game he was playing? I didn't understand. There was still that rattling sound, but it had gradually quieted. 10 seconds or so had passed, and I couldn't take it anymore. I pushed the shirts and jackets aside, and I'll never forget what I saw. I saw Mr. Tanaka in the closet, hanging from his neck. He must have been either sitting or crouching on the suitcase I had pulled away. He was suspended on the clothes rail in there. I ran over to help. I tried my best to pull the rope from around his neck, but it wouldn't budge. My mind raced with panicking, disjointed thoughts, then one clear one came to me. I need something sharp to cut the rope. Mr. Tanaka wasn't moving, and this was really bad. The rope was way too thick for scissors to be of any help. I had no choice. I had to try and get a neighbor to help. The police and ambulance services arrived. I was interviewed by the police at the scene. My parents traveled up, and when they arrived, I remember I just broke down, bawled my eyes out. Mr. Tanaka was taken away in an ambulance. He lived through the night, but passed away in the morning of the next day, and I couldn't save him in time. The least I could do for him was to finish the cleaning. I thought that it would help me too to do that, but it was so much in the process. I made sure his apartment looked good though. I had some strange compulsion to finish his final request. I went to take my payment, and inside the envelope was a note as well as the money that he had promised me. The note revealed that he had been laid off. His company had been looking to make cutbacks. Shortly after he found out his wife had been cheating on him with another man. His debt and loans seemed insurmountable to him, which is why he decided to just end things. At the end of his note, he apologized to me for all the trouble he had caused me. He explained how he needed assistance to go through with it, and the cleaning job was just a ruse to get me to help. I showed this note to the police, and it put me in the clear. Police even let me keep the money. About a week went by, and Mr. Tanaka's sister got in touch. He had long been estranged from her, and she revealed a certain truth that hasn't set well with me, and I wish that she didn't tell me. Mr. Tanaka was a believer in a certain dangerous cult-like religion. In that religion, the act of taking one's life is considered a terrible sin and is prohibited. If you did that, then you would be condemned to hell for all eternity. So, he couldn't take his own life, and that's why he needed me. I was given 100,000 yen, or $900 from his family, and his estate for all the trouble that he had caused me. According to Mr. Tanaka's interpretation, am I now a murderer? I wonder if I'll go to hell now for killing someone for 115,000 yen, or $1,050. You can share this story if you feel compelled, and I just want to thank you for listening. I work at a funeral home, and we have a crematorium at work. This happened not too long ago, but I don't think I'll ever forget it. One morning, I was sweeping the entranceway, and a black SUV pulled into our parking area. A middle-aged man got out, and I could tell that he was wealthy. I clocked the Frank Meulen watch on his wrist. Nice. He came over and inquired about a cremation service. Well, he literally said, "Can you burn a body for me?" I was taken aback by that statement. Normally, we are contacted by family members of the departed, and they don't always arrive with the body in their car. Then, of course, we need a certification of death and some other documentation. We needed to be informed ahead of time because we need to make preparations. He said that he called my boss already, and the boss agreed to cremate the body today. His tone was pretty aggressive. He said we needed to get this cremation moving fast. I asked him to wait for a moment while I went to check with my boss. I felt kind of nervous. This seemed highly unusual. My boss was the director of the funeral hall, and he said that we have to do the cremation as fast as we can. This was really weird. Why are we doing these things so different today, I wondered. I couldn't do anything about it though, it was just my job, so I went to open the ovens. I saw the body. It belonged to a man who looked to be in his early 30s. I'd seen a lot of corpses before, but there was something slightly different about this one. His cheeks seemed pink. I usually check the corpse before burning, it's part of the rules here, and I noticed that it was very clean and appeared to be without any trauma. I put the body into the coffin and pushed the coffin into the cremation ovens. After about 20 minutes or so, I heard this dreadful noise rising from the ovens. It was like a banging sound. Everything suddenly was plunged into darkness all around me. Life felt incredibly cold as I asked myself the deeply troubling question, was he alive when he went in there? What hurt the most was the fact that there was nothing I could do, because 20 minutes in the ovens at heat that high, everything is already burning. I couldn't move. My limbs were shaking with fear and I felt paralyzed. Was I hearing things? I couldn't be sure. Usually after an hour, everything in the ovens is reduced to cinders, but I couldn't stand that. I needed to know. I managed to pull myself together and stop the ovens, and I noticed that the rich guy wasn't around anymore. I was really so scared, so I asked my boss to open the ovens with me, and I told him that I heard a noise while they were on. My boss opened the ovens, and all the stench of grilled meat invaded our nostrils. It was kind of like a barbecue smell, and it lingered in the air. My boss then pulled the main tray out so we could see, and the body was half burned. It was facing down. I was pretty certain that he wasn't facing downward when I put the body in. I was sure that the man was still alive when he was brought in. I imagine while the ovens were on, he was turning and doing anything in his power to escape. I hadn't been hearing things and I was completely destroyed by this realization. This has never happened before. Never had I seen the body turn over during cremation. I was sat in the main hall with my head in my hands, struggling with the weight of the situation I was in. My boss came over to me and handed me something. 10 million yen, which is about $77,000. He told me that telling my story to anyone wouldn't be worth it. People wouldn't believe me and reminded me that the rich guy I met at the start of this story wouldn't be very happy if he heard that I was talking about what happened today. I quit that job, obviously, but now I'm living on the money that I was given until I get a new job. I'm not myself anymore. I can barely find the energy to get out of bed. I can't really sleep these days. My nightmares are filled with the memories of that day. And sometimes I dream that I'm the man in the coffin and I feel the heat surrounding me. I kick and scream and then I wake up covered in sweat. I am not doing well. When I first got into high school, I got into trouble a few times and ended up skipping school regularly. I would stay at home and watch TV or just play games. I used to take care of my younger brother a lot too. At night, I used to go out skateboarding or go over to a friend's house to play more games. I probably wasn't the best babysitter, I just left him to his own devices most of the time. One evening, I was having dinner with my little brother and we were both watching TV together. I should mention that my mother was in and out of the hospital at the time. I guess that was maybe why I was acting out at school. Every night it was just me and my little brother since Dad worked late. After he finished eating, he suddenly said, "Oh yeah, the phone. I need the phone." My younger brother was 4 years old, by the way. "Hey, where? What? What are you talking about?" I need the phone," he kept repeating while running off. Our home phone was in the hallway and he ran in that direction. I was confused, so I went after him. He was trying to reach the phone on the phone table in the hallway. He was on his tiptoes and he nearly had it. He was whining, asking for the phone. No, you can't play with that. Who are you trying to call anyways? Are you trying to talk to Mom? I mean, she's not coming back from the hospital yet, buddy." He started to cry and he shouted at me to hurry up and give him the phone. I had to pick him up and drag him back to the living room kicking and screaming, and he really wanted the phone. Just then, the phone began to ring. The second my brother heard it, he started struggling against me more, screaming about how it was for him. I said to wait there, I'll go get the phone for you, okay, because you can't reach it. And he suddenly stopped his tantrum and then waited patiently for me to bring him the phone. It was pretty weird, but it was about to get a whole lot weirder. "Hello?" I said as I answered the phone. I'll keep my brother's name just anonymous, just in case. Yeah. Can I speak to Anon, please?" The voice belonged to an older woman in about her 50s, I'd say. It wasn't a voice that I recognized. It was really strange. I wonder what the hell a stranger in their 50s would want to speak to a 4-year-old about. "Can I ask who's calling?" I asked. A friend." "Huh? A friend?" I hung up and was really confused. I walked back into the lounge and I saw my little brother sat there on the sofa, grinning at me. Did you give our number out to some old lady?" I asked him, and he said nothing. "Have you been speaking to this old lady?" And then he said, I don't understand. I don't know. I hate this." I walked back to the phone and checked the caller ID for the number. It was our area code, but I didn't recognize the number. I tried to call it back a few times, but every time I tried, the line was busy. Meanwhile, my mom came home from the hospital and I explained what had happened. Mom looked pretty freaked out. She was just as unaware of this as I was. From that day onwards, we got calls from that number every now and then. It was weird. Anytime my parents went out, about 2 minutes later, the phone would ring. My little brother would start shouting and screaming for the phone, and then when I answered, the old lady hung up. Whenever I called back then, the line was always busy. I moved the phone to a really high place that I could only reach when I stood on a stool. I didn't want that horrible voice speaking to my little brother again. A few weeks later, I had used the phone to speak to the police about the old lady and the nuisance calls. Once again, I was home alone with my brother. My parents weren't home and I can't remember where they were. I was in the bathroom and I had heard the phone ringing. I thought, it's that old woman again. I heard my brother running to the hallway. Like I said, I was in the bathroom, so I just thought to myself, oh well, he can't reach it. And then I heard this horrible clattering sound. My brother then said, "Hello? Hello?" When I came out of the bathroom, I was surprised to see that he had pulled the phone line with enough momentum to bring the phone down from the high place that I had put it. I ran straight over to him, and he was lying on the floor, happily chatting away. "Yeah, sure. Yeah, come and play. Yeah." I snatched the phone out of his hand and put it to my ear, but all I heard was a dial tone. And from that day forward, my brother never jumped up and down and went crazy when the phone rang, and there were no further calls from that weird lady's number either. 7 years have passed since then, and my brother says that he doesn't even remember this at all. And anytime my parents or I bring it up, he always scowls and accuses us of lying. I'm worried about what might have happened, and I'm worried that they might be hiding something. How did that old lady get our number?
I'm a female and a former 7-Eleven employee. I worked there 2 years ago for a span of about 6 months. During that time, I was finishing up my education. I mostly worked overnight shifts there, which were fine with me. Sure, being alone at nights is a little strange sometimes, but hardly anybody would come in. For the most part, it was easy. One night, I was working like any other. I sat behind the counter, going on my phone and listening to music. I had been alone, all by myself, with no customers, for probably an hour. A few people had gotten gas, but none of them came inside. The time was probably 2 o'clock in the morning. Then, I suddenly heard the door opening and saw a guy walking in. I hadn't seen a car pull in, and the gas station is not really at a location where people walk to. He walked in and came up to me at the counter. I said hi to him and asked him how I could help. The man asked me where the beer was, and I pointed to the back of the store where they were. We also had some cases sitting around, which I pointed out as well. The man looked around and then walked to the back of the store. I kept sitting there and then went back on my phone. A few minutes later, the man came back up to me at the counter. This guy was sort of tall and thin, was balding, and looked to be in his 40s or 50s. When he came back to the counter, he was not holding any beer. The guy said to me that he liked my tattoos and pointed to my arms. Then he just kind of stood there. I said thanks and asked if he needed help with something. The guy just stared at me for a second and then kind of wandered out of the store. He seemed a little bit off to me, and after he left, I just went back to minding my own business. I had a coworker coming in at 5 a.m., and I would be getting off at 6. Over the next hour, I only had one other customer come inside and pay for gas. At about 3 a.m., I suddenly noticed something out of the corner of my eye. It was coming from the window near the front door. When I looked, I saw the guy who had been inside earlier who had seemed a little bit off. He was looking inside and pressing his face up against the glass window. The look on his face was rather disturbing and creepy. He was looking straight at me as well. I looked at him and then looked away. I wasn't amused by this. It seemed really weird. When I looked back over again about a minute later, he was still there. I tried to just ignore it, but then he started knocking on the window. This guy had to be crazy or something. I decided to get up and ask the man what he was doing and probably tell him to leave as well. I got out from behind the counter and walked over. I opened up the front door to the building, but as soon as I opened it, the man started sprinting away at what appeared to be full speed. He ran all the way past the road and out of my sight. Oh well, I thought, and went back inside to work, shaking my head. For the next few hours, things were peaceful and went on like normal. At 5, my coworker Alex showed up, and things were really easy then. And at 6, I was off for the day and could finally leave. When I was walking out to my car in the parking lot, I happened to notice the man again. He was standing kind of in the grass between the parking lot and the road. The guy was looking right at me. I hurried up and got inside my car and left. After I left, I called my coworker Alex and let him know about the guy just to be aware. Luckily, the man didn't follow me out of the parking lot when I left or anything like that. Now, fast forward 2 days. I worked one of the 2 days and didn't come across the man or anything strange. But on the second day, I was hanging out with a few friends. There's a diner in town that we hang out at a lot. We're friends with the owner and their family, and my friends and I have been going there for years. I was there, sitting in a booth with 2 other friends. We were just hanging out, talking, and having some food. Out of nowhere, I happened to notice the guy who had been at the gas station. He was sitting by himself on the other side of the diner. The whole place wasn't very big. It had maybe like 10 booths and then seats at the diner. The guy was facing me, and I caught him staring. I told my friends about him and who he was. We weren't really sure what to do though. I felt like the chances of this being a coincidence were really slim. But still, he wasn't bothering me and hadn't come up to me or anything like that, so I decided to just ignore it. The man never tried talking to me or anything. When I left, he didn't follow me outside either. For the next few days, the man was completely absent from my life, and that's the way I would have liked it to stay. But then came the last time that I saw the man. It was a typical work shift, and for 90% of it, everything went fine. I didn't see the guy and had dealt with mostly normal customers. When my coworker Alex came in the early morning like he often did, he let me know that it looked like someone was messing around near my car in the parking lot. I walked over to the window and looked. That same guy was appearing to try and open one of my windows or something. It looked like he had some kind of tool as well. I opened the door and yelled out to him, asking what he was doing. The guy looked at me and then ran off down the street. It was so strange. I went over and looked, but luckily he hadn't broken in, at least not yet. After that though, I never saw the guy again. I only worked at the 7-Eleven for about another month after that. Gas stations in the middle of the night can be a weird place. A few months back, I was driving home from visiting some friends. I didn't time out the drive very well, and I found myself on the road at nearly 3 o'clock in the morning. I still had a ways to go, but I had lots of caffeine and was doing fine. When my car was starting to run out of gas, I decided to stop at the next place. I took an exit when I saw a sign that there would be a 7-Eleven at the next one. They're usually a good gas station, and I go there all the time. When I pulled in, there was another car getting gas and somebody else in the parking lot. I pulled up to one of the pumps at the south side of it, sort of far away from the building. I paid at the pump and then began fueling my car. As I stood near the car, the other person getting gas drove off. This revealed that there was just one guy now, and he was standing near some of the other gas pumps about 20 feet away, but there were no other cars there. About a minute into me fueling my car, I saw the man start to walk over and approach me. He had a beard and wore kind of baggy and dirty clothes. He walked right up to me, which made me a little bit nervous. When he reached me, he asked me if I had a cigarette he could borrow. I told the guy no. I didn't smoke, and even if I did, I certainly wasn't going to give him a cigarette right next to a gas pump. There are literally signs everywhere that say no smoking. The guy stood there looking at me for a moment or two after I had answered him. Then he turned away and started walking. He walked back over to another pump as I continued to fill my tank, which always takes a long time. Then, out of seemingly nowhere, the man yelled something and punched a gas pump. It made a loud noise. He hit it a few times, which was really disturbing to see. Then, he angrily started walking over towards the convenience store. He got next to it, where they had rocks up against the building. The man proceeded to grab a few rocks in his hands and start throwing them in my direction. He missed badly with the first couple, but he started walking closer. I couldn't believe my eyes. I had no idea why he was doing this. I quickly stopped getting gas and got inside of my car. A rock actually hit my car after I had gotten back inside. I drove off with the man still firing rocks in my direction. When I was out of there and back on the road, I called the police to report him. I was afraid for whoever was working inside the 7-Eleven, or if anybody else would try to get gas there. They let me know that they would have an officer there shortly to check out the situation. I really hoped that nobody was hurt and everything was resolved. The man definitely seemed like he was on some sort of drugs. He certainly was not in his right mind. It's a pretty scary experience that I will never forget, and I hope the man and everybody else are okay.
Not too long ago, I was working at McDonald's, and for context, I was a 17-year-old female at the time. McDonald's that I worked at was a very busy location. There was hardly any downtime, and it was never really slow. Well, I was taking orders one day when this man came in. I'd have to say that he was in his 50s, bald head, and this big gray mustache. He came up to the counter and ordered 2 McChickens and a large fry. The man paid, and I gave him the receipt. When the food was cooked, I handed the bag to him. It was a very normal transaction, except this guy was furious. When he looked into his bag and grabbed a French fry, he immediately spit it out. He started making a huge scene about how his fries weren't hot enough and demanded fresh ones. It always makes me uncomfortable when customers start yelling and making a scene. I politely apologized to him and said that I would get him fresh ones right away. I gave him the fresh fries, but he still had this pissed off look on him. He snatched the fries out of my hands and stormed out of the restaurant. The dude was a total asshole, but it doesn't end there. 2 days after that happened, I was working and I had to use the bathroom. I was in there doing my business when I heard someone else walk in. I didn't think anything of it and continued scrolling on my phone while doing my business. But that's when I saw 2 feet standing outside my stall. I looked up and saw a pair of eyes looking at me through the slit in the bathroom stall door. It was the upset customer from 2 days ago, but I couldn't say anything. He started shaking my stall violently. He rammed his shoulder into the door, trying to get in. I screamed my head off. I screamed so loud, I was surprised that none of the bathroom mirrors broke. Within seconds, I could hear some of my coworkers come into the bathroom. I could hear a scuffle, but ultimately, the upset customer was tackled and held down. Thankfully, an off-duty cop was eating his lunch in our McDonald's and came in to assist. The guy ended up getting arrested, but get this, he had a hammer and a knife on him. He was planning to hurt me, or even worse, all because that I messed up his order. The guy was arrested, and I had to move to a different McDonald's for safety reasons, in case that he got out and came back for me. I ended up quitting altogether to work for my aunt's flower shop, but people can be nutcases, all because he didn't like the way his fries were cooked. I'm glad I quit that job.
I really wasn't planning on telling this story, but it's been a few years and I'm not as freaked out by what happened as I used to be, so why not? I was only 19 at the time. I moved across the country the year before college and had never had any issues driving home for the different breaks that we had over the school year. It was winter break and my mom really wanted me to come home that year to celebrate the holidays with my family since I hadn't the year before. I agreed, but I really didn't want to leave my car for weeks. There had been a lot of car break-ins in the city that I lived in, and leaving my car to be vandalized, broken into, or stolen just was not an option to me. I told my mom that I'd be driving home, and she wasn't too happy about it, but understood. She offered to have my dad fly out and drive with me, but I didn't want them to go through all that trouble, and I thought a few days on the road by myself would be a good thing. I've been having issues in my personal life, and having the time to think about it without any distractions seemed like a good thing to me. I packed up a few bags that would last me the next few weeks and said bye to my roommate, who was pretty bummed out about me leaving, and headed out the door. Thinking back on it now, my car probably wasn't worth what I went through during that drive home. It was a 20-year-old Honda Civic that had the propensity to break down a lot, and by a lot I mean at least once a month. I just didn't have the money to replace it. I hopped in the car and was on the highway within a few minutes. I got some coffee before heading out of the city so I could stay awake as long as possible. It was still around 8 in the morning, so I figured I'd drive for around 10 hours before hopefully finding a hotel and settling in for the night. I had no definite plans and was following the fastest route home, which probably wasn't the best decision. I know now that I should have taken the route that didn't involve long stretches of highway with nothing but fields for miles and miles. I stopped a few times for a bathroom and snack breaks, and by at around 7 p.m. I was done. I'd been driving for almost 11 hours and didn't want to be a hazard to myself or others on the road if I kept driving while being that exhausted. I found a relatively nice hotel and got a room for the night and continued my drive the next morning. That day I'd be driving through parts of the Midwest, and it wasn't necessarily something I was looking forward to. The last time I drove through it, it was a lot of just flat land and cornfields, both things I thought were boring to look at on a long road trip. It was winter though, so there was no corn. The weather could have been better, but I had no issues the day before, so I hoped that it would stay that way. The day went by faster than the previous one, and the sun was down before I knew it. By 6 p.m. I was feeling pretty good to keep going, so I passed through the next city and drove on. Around 7, I started hearing a knocking sound and wanted to cry when I realized that it was coming from my engine. It had started to snow, and my car began to creep along the road until I pulled to the side of the road where it completely gave out. It was getting cold without the heater on, and I knew that I had to get help very soon. I checked Google Maps to see if I was close to another city, but the next town, albeit a very small one, was still almost an hour away. I tried calling my parents to tell them what happened, but my service was completely out. I decided to use the emergency calls only button on my phone to call for help, and thank God it worked. The only problem was the closest officer that could respond was at least an hour away in the town that I mentioned earlier. I told the dispatcher that obviously I'd wait, and she instructed me to lock the doors and try to hide myself inside the car enough to where it looked as though no one was inside. Apparently, right where my car decided to die on me also happened to be a very sketchy section of the highway that wasn't very safe for stranded drivers, especially young women. I'm not gonna lie, having the dispatcher tell me that made me feel physically ill. I felt like I was gonna have a heart attack with how fast my heart was racing. I put up a sun shield in the windshield area and thankfully had 3 extra ones in the car from when I went car camping, and decided to put those along the sides and back windshield as well so no one could see it and it would look like almost black from the outside. Around 30 minutes into me waiting, I started getting the feeling like somebody was watching me. Now, I tried convincing myself that it was just because of the situation that I was in and that all the windows were covered anyway, so there was no way that that was possible. I wanted to shake it off, but the feeling just wouldn't go away. No matter how much I told myself that I was okay, there was something inside of me telling me the situation I was in was about to get very, very scary. I turned on the screen on my phone and faced it in the direction of the windows, not knowing what I was about to see would traumatize me for years to come. At first, I felt some ease seeing only the reflection of the sun shield. I turned my phone towards the passenger side windows, and in the small crack that wasn't covered, to my horror, a strip of window was visible, and on the other side of the window was the face of a man pressed against the glass with a smile, staring directly at me. My first reaction was this blood-curdling scream. It was a sound that I didn't know that I even had the ability to make. It was like fear itself was manifesting in sound. It almost actually rang my ears, and the second the scream left my mouth, I watched as the man lifted his face from the glass and heard him begin to laugh, the most awful, guttural laugh I'd ever heard. Immediately, I heard the car move as the man violently tried the door handle to get access into my car. I was screaming and crying as he hurled himself around the car, howling like he was some animal between his laughing. It felt like he was taunting me in a way. I called 911 again and was screaming that I needed help now. The woman who answered the second time wasn't as friendly as the first I'd spoken to only 30 minutes prior. She kept yelling at me to stop screaming, otherwise she wasn't going to be able to help me. I was crying, trying my best to calm down as the man outside began to bang on my window with what sounded like a hard object that possibly would make it possible for him to break into my car. The dispatcher began threatening me, telling me that it wasn't okay to prank 911, even though I insisted what was happening was very real. After 10 minutes of just pure agony, trying to make her understand as the man just outside my car was putting me through this, she hung up on me. And I felt completely helpless. In the moment, the only relief that I was feeling was the fact that he hadn't been able to break into my car. I called 911 again, hoping I'd get a dispatcher with more empathy, and thankfully that was the case. A man answered and immediately took my distress into account and helped me calm down enough to get the information he needed. The officer had been sent almost 45 minutes before, and now was only around 10 minutes away, and I was told that they'd have him get to me as quickly as possible, given what I was going through. I was hopeful, but that hope was ripped away when I heard the sound of what was obviously a rock being thrown at my windshield. It shattered just enough to motivate the man to get on top of my hood and start stomping the windshield until it was broken enough for him to reach a hand inside. I screamed and climbed into the back seat. I was trying my best to get out of reach of this very insane and clearly dangerous person. He started tearing the windshield out of the way, and his face was even scarier than it was the first time I saw it. I was paralyzed with fear as I watched him begin to climb between the glass into the car. I had no choice but to get out of the car and hope the officer was close by. I opened the door and turned on my phone's flashlight. I faced it toward the hood and was so relieved to see that he had become stuck. He was trying to climb out but wasn't able to. I then saw the beautiful, flashing red and blue lights in the distance and heard the sirens as he drove closer. I started frantically waving him down, and he pulled up beside me. He was out of his car in seconds, and another police car was pulling up behind him only a few minutes later. I was placed in one of the cop cars and watched as they actually drew their guns out, demanding that the man climb out of the car. This crazy guy was screaming and thrashing his body around. One of the officers grabbed him by the ankles and pulled him out of the vehicle. The man tried biting him multiple times before being slammed to the ground and handcuffed. They put him in the back of the other car and told me more officers would be coming down to take pictures of the scene, and a tow truck would be down to tow my car. I was driving to the police station and gave my statement about everything that happened. I called my parents, who bought me a plane ticket home from the nearest airport, which the officers were nice enough to drive me to. I wish I could tell you the man who did that to me even gave a reason as to why, but he didn't. He was so mentally deranged that they said that he wasn't even fit to stand trial eventually, and I guess he was taken to some state mental hospital where the last I heard he's still there. I wish that there was some justice for the hell that he put me through, and maybe some people would say there was, but to me, it wasn't justice. He isn't being punished. I am. The memory of what happened punishes me every day. It's gotten easier to deal with as time goes by, but it'll always be there to torture me anytime I'm reminded of that man in the window.
When this happened, I was 23 and worked full-time at a pizza shop in my local area. I'm not sure if things were going on before this, but as far as I know, everything started and ended on this one night. Me and my best friend, Tim, worked the night shifts at this pizza place. It was a real small shop because we specialized in delivery and takeout. Both me and Tim got our jobs there while we were in college, but just never left. Being in a quiet, rural town too, the job wasn't too much work. Never had busy days really, just a steady flow of orders sometimes. On this night, there was a light storm outside, and in return, business was slow. There were a few orders here and there, but overall, we didn't have much to do. By 10 p.m., Tim suggested we started cleaning up the place, and maybe even clocking out 15 minutes early. I went with it, grabbing some rags to wipe the tables with, when the phone at the front desk rang. I picked up after a few rings.
How can we help you today? Hello?
I waited another 5 seconds before putting the phone down and shaking my head. Just some prank call, I thought. I went back to scrubbing the tables, but at the front of the store, I saw a glare coming from the window. There was a car parked a few spots back. I couldn't see too well through the window in the rain, but there was definitely a light on in the car, like a cell phone or something. The pizza shop was on an individual lot, and there were no other cars, so that was the only reason I noticed them. A moment later, the phone rang again. Tim was closer, so he picked up this time. I could hear someone's muffled voice coming from the phone, and after a short talk, Tim hung up. At the same time, the light in the car turned off, and they drove away. I told Tim what I saw and how it was a little weird, but he shrugged and said it was just some old man who was ordering a pizza for delivery. I looked back at the now empty parking lot. It wouldn't make much sense for someone to order a pizza for delivery from right outside the shop, so I figured Tim was right and it was nothing. He started making the pizza while I continued cleaning. 10 minutes later, Tim boxed it up and handed it off to me to deliver. I ran through the rain to my car, then pulled up the address on my phone. 11 minutes away. Not too bad. I pulled out and started making my way there. The roads were dead, nobody out at all. Google Maps took me down to a neighborhood full of large homes, then had me turn down a long driveway that led to a cul-de-sac, where there were 3 more driveways, each leading to a different house. I went down the one Maps told me to and pulled up next to the home. It was one of those large expensive houses, but pretty old looking and not very modern at all. I parked the car and double-checked the address with the house number, then picked up the pizza and ran up to the front door.
Hello? Pizza delivery.
I took a step back and looked at the front of the house. All of the lights were off. I dialed Tim's cell and had him call the guy who ordered. My phone buzzed a moment later, and Tim told me that his call went straight to voicemail. I shook my head in frustration and ran back through the rain to my car and got in. I tossed the pizza on the passenger seat and started backing out. This wasn't out of the ordinary, getting fake orders or dead deliveries, but it still annoyed me every time. When I got back, Tim was cleaning and said there were no more orders, so we were good to finish up and head out. I tossed the pizza in the trash and started helping him. Both of us were in the back, cleaning the ovens and wiping the prep counters, when a sudden bang came from the front of the building. We looked at each other, then ran to the front. At first, we didn't see anything, but then Tim spotted a small crack on the door. I walked over and opened it, and right outside was a heavy rock, big enough to throw and do some damage with. I looked around, seeing the parking lot was completely empty and nobody was nearby. Both of us were really confused and kind of freaked out. We talked about maybe calling the cops, but neither of us wanted to deal with that right now. To put things in perspective, it was 10 minutes before we were off, and if we called, then we'd be here for another hour at least. The crack on the door wasn't too big, not really that noticeable, so we chose to wait and just tell our manager the next day instead. We quickly finished up with the cleaning and left through the back door where our cars were parked. On the drive home, I rethought all the strange things that happened, and it made me uneasy. I pulled into my driveway and walked inside. It was late, so I knew I had to get in bed soon, but I wanted something to snack on first. I went to the kitchen to see what I had, but before I even opened the pantry, I heard a car splash through the puddles on the street outside my house. From the sound of it, I could tell it was parking. I walked over to my window and peeked outside, seeing a car parked right in front of my driveway. It only took me a second to realize it was the same car I'd seen outside the pizza shop. A cold rush went through me, and I stayed in the window to see what they were doing. The car was still on, but I couldn't see through their window. After a minute of no movement, I took out my phone and called Tim, telling him that I think one of the customers followed me home and was parked right outside my house.
Are you serious? You need to call the cops. Something's not right.
He said, urging me to hang up and call the police immediately. I don't know why I was so nervous to call the cops, but hearing Tim say it made me feel better about it. I moved away from the window and dialed 911. The lady on the line said that they would have someone on their way and that I should stay hidden and wait. I heard a car door open and close, so I quickly said okay and hung up. Looking back out the window, a man was walking up my driveway. He was wearing dark clothes, covering his whole body, and a hood covering his face. As he approached the house, I closed the curtains by the window and waited. His footsteps came to the front door, then they continued across the front of the house until they reached the outside of the window and stopped. The sudden silence made the sound of the rain increasingly louder. I felt like I was standing there quietly for minutes before I stepped forward and moved the curtain an inch to the side, just enough to peek through. The man's cold eyes stared back at me. I let go of the curtain, and the man banged on the window. I stood a few feet away, terrified to death, and just as quick as it started, it ended. There was no more banging, no footsteps, nothing. All that was left was the sound of the raindrops clicking against the window. Although I never heard the man leave, he was gone when the police showed up. No car or man in sight. I told them all that had happened from the middle of my shift to the end of the night. They looked at me like I was crazy, and part of me felt crazy too. None of it made any sense, and there didn't seem to be any motive for the man to have done what he did. Honestly, because of that, the whole night had me messed up for a while. Going through something as senseless as that was really just fucked with my head. I'm hoping that by sharing this, someone may be able to help me understand what happened, or why the man did what he did. It sounds odd, but even now, when it gets really quiet on rainy days, there's an eerie feeling that rushes through me, bringing me back to that night. My house is on the edge of a small town, having several acres of land surrounding it. It isn't extremely isolated, but the nearest house is a quarter-mile away, so it's definitely not your regular neighborhood home. I chose to live there for that reason though. Anyway, I had lived there alone for almost 6 years when this happened. It was a normal weekend, and I had no plans at all. I was spending most of my time watching TV or working outside in the garden. Sometime in the afternoon, I was walking through the house and passed by a window when I saw something odd. There was a person walking through the trees far off in the distance. It was technically my property, and I knew they could see my house from there. But what was most odd was the direction they were walking. They were walking toward the back of my house, which led to nothing but a vast woodsy area. I watched by the window as they slowly walked past my backyard and kept going until I lost sight of them in the woods. I didn't care so much that they were on the edge of my property, but it was just a weird thing to see given the location of my house. I went on with my day, looking out the window a few more times to see if he ever came back, but I never saw anything. Later in the night, I sat down to watch a movie in my living room. In the middle of the movie, I began hearing footsteps. They were soft and slow, walking through the leaves outside. I got up quietly and looked out a nearby window. I jumped back, seeing a man just a couple feet from me. After the initial shock, I poked my head up again. He looked like he didn't even notice me at all. He was still walking, slowly making his way across my yard. They looked like the same person I had seen earlier, but it was hard to say for sure. I watched them walk all the way to the other side of my property and go into the trees. It was one of the creepiest things I'd ever seen, especially since he came so close to my house this time. I stayed up a little bit later than usual to make sure he didn't come back, and I was ready to call the police if he did. By 11, I hadn't seen any signs of him at all, so I felt safe enough to get some sleep. I went upstairs and passed out. I don't know exactly what time, but I woke up in the middle of the night to that familiar sound. Footsteps right outside my house. As I got dressed and ran downstairs, the sound stopped. I looked through every window and didn't see anyone. Then I went up to the front door and looked out the peephole. That same man was standing in my driveway, looking up at my house. It was an eerie sight, like he was plotting something. I got my phone and contacted the police, but I knew it would be probably 15 to 20 minutes before they would even be here. When I looked out at the driveway again, the man was gone, and that's when I heard the same footsteps around the side of my house. I waited quietly, hoping he'd just go away, but then there was a sharp, sudden sound from my backyard, followed by absolute silence. I was shaking, standing in the same spot, when the sound of another shot rang through the house. The silence afterward lasted for 15 minutes until the police arrived. When they did, I heard them yelling outside, telling the man to drop the gun and everything. This went on for a few minutes, but eventually the police were able to get the man to comply. There's no clear answer as to what he was doing, and after I told them about what I'd seen earlier, with him walking back and forth through the woods, it only complicated things more. As far as I know, the man was pleading it as a temporary act of insanity. Nobody knows for sure if that's true or not, but I find it hard to believe. I've been working at a warehouse for 4 years now. Compared to others, it's really small. From the outside, you probably would never even guess it was a warehouse. It's owned by a small tech company that only moves its own product, so there isn't a need for a big building. Me and my coworker, Seth, were the two main overnight workers, taking turns on the night shifts, but almost never working together. The night shift worker always had to fly solo. The main job for the overnight guy was to fill out paperwork, like inventory counts and shipment confirmations, so it wasn't really a multiple person job anyway. But one night, while I was filling out these papers in the back room, I heard a knock echo through the front of the building. When I walked to the front, there was a man standing outside the building's main entrance. He had his hands above his eyes, pressing his face against the glass door like he was trying to look inside. I walked closer to the door, and once he noticed me, he moved his face back and knocked again to get my attention.
Open the door.
He yelled, grabbing the handle and shaking the door violently. I told him he needed to leave and that the doors were not open to the public. He looked at me through the glass for a moment, then calmly walked away. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but thought it had to be some drunk guy or something. I continued with my work, but on the following night, the same thing happened. I heard the knocks, and the man was back at the entrance doors. He yelled at me again to open the door. I told him that he needed to leave, and if he ever comes back, I would call the cops right away. I think that did it, because he immediately turned around and quickly walked away from the building. The next few weeks, he never showed up. I mentioned him to some of the day workers, but they'd never seen the guy before. Then one night, I thought I heard something by the back of the building. It was a thud, I thought from the outside of the building, but I wanted to be sure. I walked to the back, but everything looked fine. Nothing had fallen over or was out of place. I walked further down to the far wall, and that's when I noticed the back door. I started wondering if that guy had come back and was at this door instead. Maybe that's what the sound was. This one wasn't glass though, and there were no windows on it, so I had no way of knowing what was on the other side. I checked to make sure it was locked, and it was, but I still had a strange feeling about it. I was tempted to open it and look around, but I knew better than to do that. I went back to work, only to hear that same sound a few minutes later. I checked again, and everything was fine inside, but the more I looked at the back door, the more of this strange feeling I got. Then I got an idea. I hurried back to the main office and decided to ease my mind by checking the security camera on the back of the building. My manager always told me that I should really never do this, but I really felt like I had to. It took me a second to find the right camera footage, but once I did, I saw that same man standing against the back door. He was leaning with his ear pressed against it, probably listening to me and hoping I'd open it. I called the cops, but it was like this guy knew somehow, because as soon as I put the phone down, he walked away. Over the next 2 days, we went through the past 2 weeks of security footage. After the 2 times I saw that guy at the front entrance and told him to leave, he continued to come to the building every single night, leaning up against the back door and listening. It was really creepy seeing this guy was at the building every night without me knowing. We had the cops stay on patrol outside the building for a few weeks after this, but the man never showed up again. I don't know what he wanted, but I still worry that he's gonna come back. This happened last month while I was still living at my previous condo. It was connected to 3 other units, and I was renting the 4th. I worked from home, and one day at noon while I was taking a break, someone rang my doorbell. I went up and answered, greeting a young lady. She was small and skinny, wearing ripped jeans and a tank top. I looked at her, waiting for her to say why she was here, but after a couple seconds, I just asked. She asked me if I was the only one living here. The way she said it was like she was confused by me being there. I said yes, and she apologized, saying she must have the wrong address. I said not to worry about it and closed the door. I went back to work after that and didn't think much else of it. A few more hours into the day, once I was done working, I went out to the supermarket and got back home around 8. When I entered my condo, I felt like something was off. I didn't know what it was, but I went ahead and put my groceries away and started cooking dinner. A few minutes in, I hear something from one of my bedrooms down the hall. All the doors in the hallway were closed, and I had no idea what the sound was, but I tried to convince myself that it was just my upstairs neighbor. I finished making my food and sat at the small dining table to eat. That's when I heard a door open. It took me a second to realize it was from my condo and not a neighbor's. I stood up and froze, hearing footsteps coming down the hallway from the bedrooms and approaching the kitchen. A second later, a man appeared from the hallway. He didn't say anything. He didn't even look at me. He just walked right past me and over to the front door, opening it and leaving. I was still standing by the table, terrified. I ran to the front door and locked myself in a bathroom. I know the man was gone, but I was still scared that he might come back. Luckily he didn't, but police weren't able to gather any information on him. I told them everything I knew, but I only saw him for a moment and he didn't even look at me, so I never got a clear view. We asked the neighbors too, and none of them said they heard or saw anything. What's really scary is that there's no signs of a break-in, so it looks like he had to have some sort of key to get in. I also told the police about the lady that came by and how it was a weird encounter. It may have been a setup for them to scope out the place before entering. I just don't understand why this happened to me. There were a few things missing, but amounting to less than $100 total. Maybe I got home before he had the chance to grab more, but he didn't even have a backpack or anything, and the fact that they must have had a key only had me paranoid even more. I was able to move out, but it's only been a month, so I'm still shaken up. I'll probably have this to think about for the rest of my life, never knowing exactly what happened.
I used to work at a 7-Eleven here in the United States, and the scariest thing that ever happened to me there was also the single most terrifying thing that's ever happened to me in my life. It happened on a particularly quiet night, and I was still kind of hungover from going out drinking the night before, so I wasn't even paying attention when the guy walked into the store. I heard the door sliding open, I heard his footsteps as he walked up to the counter, and then right when I was about to lift my head up to ask him what he wanted, he just slammed something down on the counter in front of me. I remember the first thing being the red splatter on my t-shirt. It was plain white, and the moment his hand impacted on the counter, all these little red specks appeared on my shirt. I already recoiled from the shock of having his hand slammed down in front of me, but when I saw what he just slammed down next to the register, I recoiled even further. It was a tongue, an actual tongue. Even though it was soaked in blood, I could recognize the deep ridge running down the middle of it. It sounds like such a cliche when I think about it now, but I now know what people mean when they say that they were frozen in fear. The whole thing was an assault on my senses, and I think it just short-circuited my fight-or-flight mechanism to the point where I just didn't know what to do. Then the look in the guy's eyes as he stared at me, so calm but intense, with eyes so wide and unblinking that it was like he didn't have eyelids at all. It was only when he spoke that I actually found the will to move, and all he said to me was, "Call 911." I bolted into the back office, locked the door behind me, and immediately called the cops. All the while, I watched the guy on the cameras just standing there at the register. He didn't move at all. He just seemed to be looking down and staring at the mess he'd left on the counter. And given the gruesome nature of my emergency, there was a police patrol car and 2 cops pulling up outside in just a matter of minutes. The guy didn't put up any kind of fight when they moved to arrest him. He just held his wrists, allowed them to put the handcuffs on him, then let the cops take him away. Once he was safely out of the store, I walked out of the office, trying not to look at what was on the counter, then told the cops everything I knew. It obviously wasn't all that much, but as I was talking to them, I noticed a few more police surrounding a car in the parking lot that still had the door open. I called the store manager from the McDonald's across the street, telling him that the cops had to close the store because it was an active crime scene. They rushed down to see what was going on, even though it was their day off, and after telling them what had happened, I went home to decompress. From what I heard later, the guy had gotten into an argument with his wife while out driving somewhere. Then at some point, he'd snapped, pulled up into a parking lot, stabbed her to death, then cut her tongue out. Then, for some reason, he picked our 7-Eleven to walk into to slam the tongue he'd cut out of her mouth down onto the countertop. I was allowed to take a little bit of time off of work after the whole thing, as I just couldn't face going back there so soon. Even when I did go back, I was on edge the whole time for my first couple of shifts, and I just couldn't seem to shake the image of that bloody tongue just lying on the countertop right in front of me. The thing I just can't seem to shake is that it wasn't enough for the guy to actually stab and kill his own wife. He had to reach into her mouth afterwards and cut her tongue out. How completely insane with fury does a person have to be to do that? Like, what could possibly possess someone to do something so horrifying to their own spouse? The guy didn't look like a monster either. He didn't look evil or deranged. All that gave his mental state away was that crazy look in his eyes, the one that had me frozen in fear. It just haunts me that seemingly normal people are capable of things like that. I used to work at a 7-Eleven that was right next to an art school campus, so in addition to all the snacks and drink, we had a little stationery section and kept some stuff behind the counter too. One of the things we kept behind the counter were scissors, the kind that are sealed in a plastic casing, and one day, this customer comes in, walks up to the counter with a Gatorade, then asks if he can have a pair of scissors too. Of course, I grab a pair for him, scan them, then tell him the price of both of his items. But instead of getting his wallet out, he immediately starts removing the plastic packaging from the scissors. I didn't think it too suspicious at first. I mean, I figured he really needed them for some kind of minor emergency or something, and that he'd pay for them after cutting whatever it was that needed to be cut. Instead, once they're out of the packaging, he grips the handle like they're a knife or something, looks me right in the eye and says, "I could just kill you with these right now, you know that?" I was so stunned that I just didn't know what to say. And I know he enjoyed the fearful look on my face because of the way he started smiling. All I could do was reach for my phone in my pocket so I could start to dial 911, knowing I had no real way of defending myself and just hoping the cops would arrive before he actually killed me. But just as I tapped the numbers out, I looked up to see him walking away from the counter, laughing to himself as he walked out of the store. I stayed on the line with 911 for a while, shaking as I told him what had happened, and when the cops showed up a little while later, they took their time since it wasn't an ongoing situation. An officer reviewed the security camera footage. Turns out, the same guy had been doing the same thing all over town, picking out girls working retail on their own before shoplifting basic items like that. He had the same MO every single time too. He'd always get away with it by telling the girl that he could kill them with whatever he was stealing, be it a knife or scissors or even just a pen on one occasion. He never actually hurt anyone, not yet, according to the officer, but the cops were extra focused on getting him in cuffs because they felt like it was only a matter of time before he actually crossed that line and did hurt someone. Even though he took his time to show up, the cop was still really helpful and reassuring, and he gave me his cell number to call him directly the next time he walked into the store. I mean, how much of a notorious kleptomaniac do you have to be to actually have a detective assigned to your case? And although I didn't hear about it afterward, I sincerely hope the guy never crossed that line and actually hurt a girl with any of the items he ended up stealing. I work night shifts at a 7-Eleven in a pretty good neighborhood here in Baton Rouge, so usually it's pretty boring. And whenever a customer does actually come in, they're usually really nice and polite. I know I totally lucked out with that little aspect of it, as I've heard some real horror stories of people who work in retail. But then this one night, I had a customer visit the store that put the fear of God into me, literally too. I was just minding my own business, playing with my phone behind the register when this sweet-looking little old man came in. He was short, even shorter than me, so maybe 5'2" at the most, and he was dressed in a neatly pressed button-down shirt, almost like he could have just walked out of a church on a Sunday morning or something. When he brought his items up to the register, I made the usual small talk of asking him how his night was going, something I always did to help kill a few minutes of what were always long and boring shifts. He didn't answer my questions though, and when I looked up at him, he had this intense, almost angry look on his face, like I'd said something that had really offended him. I didn't ask anything other than, so what has you out at such an ungodly hour? And looking back, I think it was the mention of God that got him riled up. Because the next thing I know, as I was handing him his change, he firmly grabbed my wrist, made direct eye contact with me and said, "Hell is a real place, and the devil has already got his hand on you, girl." I was so scared that I opened my hand up and the change just rattled onto the countertop as he stared into my eyes. Then, with this thunderous look on his face, he swiped his change off the counter and just walked out of the store. I've never been shaken up by a customer like that before. I don't know if it was how deceiving his appearance was, how late at night and vulnerable I was, or if it was the fact that everyone was always nice, even in a job where it's so common for people to be just total jerks. I think maybe it was a combination of all three. Just this perfect storm of surprise and fear that actually left me standing there, shaking in the quiet of the store. I've never had a customer like that since. But I find I always have my guard up now whenever I'm working late like that, because the one thing it taught me is that you definitely can't judge a book by its cover. One of the most chilling moments of my whole life was while working at 7-Eleven. Some guy walks in wearing a suit, staggers over to one of the fridges and grabs a ton of those Starbucks cold brews out of one of them before dumping them all on the counter in front of me. The stink of booze off of him was just wild, and as I'm ringing him up, I asked if he'd either had a really good day or a really bad one. He's let out this really hearty laugh and then tells me, "A little of both." He then goes on to explain that he'd just gotten out of court, and that he's been acquitted of accidentally shooting one of his hunting buddies on a trip that happened a few years ago. I was so stunned that I didn't really know what to say. I just went with the first thing that came to mind, which was, "I'm sorry." He laughs again, shakes his head, and then asks me, "You know what the funniest thing is, though?" I shake my head, taking the 10 he gave me before grabbing his change from the register, and when he tells me, I swear I almost dropped his money all over the floor when he spoke. He tells me, "It was no accident." Then just starts laughing to himself while he pockets the change and scoops up all the cold brews from the counter. I was so taken aback that all I could do was just stand there, watching the guy as he walked out of the store and towards his parked car. Then my mind switches to thinking, please get into the passenger seat. Please get into the passenger seat. But nope. He climbs right into the driver's side, starts the engine, then drives off. I'm not saying I have a photographic memory or anything, more like I was repeating his license plate number back to myself as I grabbed my phone and plugged it into the Notepad app. Then I called the cops, told them they had a drunk driver on their hands, then just let karma do its thing. There was nothing I could do about him taking one person's life and getting away with it. But I sure wasn't about to stand by and let him kill someone else as the result of being a reckless idiot. Last year I moved from a dense urban area to a really pretty underpopulated rural one. I got super into trail running. There's a big circular route that I like a lot in the local nature preserve, and over the summer, I was on an early morning run there when I passed a dude sitting on a rock slightly off the trail. He looked exceedingly normal, street clothes, etc. All good. So I make my way down the path to the point where it comes out near a highway that has a 7-Eleven on it. I made it kind of a tradition of mine to go buy some ice-cold water at the end of my run, then I basically chug it as I walk back to my house. Then this one time, just as I'm walking back onto the trail, I hear a twig snap, and I straighten up to see that guy, crouched over and stepping through the woods off the clearing like he's trying to creep up on me. I bolted. The sprint back was the most terrifying experience of my life, obviously. I don't know if I lost him or if he gave chase at all. The police never found anyone matching his description, and I don't run anywhere near there anymore. I work at a 7-Eleven part-time in between classes, and earlier this year, we got a little rush of customers in the early afternoon one time. I served 2 guys for coffee and smokes, and at the back of the line, there's this kid, no older than maybe 11 or 12, just waiting there patiently with a backpack in his hand. I actually thought that he looked kind of cute, like a little gentleman out doing some grocery shopping for his mom or something. He gets to the front of the line and I ask him, "What can I help you with, sir?" in a kind of jokey, playful way. Without a hint of emotion on his face, he just pulls out a gun and says, "Give me all the money." When he pointed it at me, I wasn't sure if it was real or not, because where the hell would a 12-year-old kid get their hands on a loaded gun like that? It's not like the 7-Eleven I work at is in some high crime area or whatever. It's actually located in a pretty nice place, and although I've heard 1 or 2 stories from coworkers about the trouble at the store, nothing had ever happened to me personally. There was one other guy in the store at the time, and I looked over at him to see him kind of smiling at the kid. Smiling and frowning, like he was amused but disapproved of the kid playing some dumb childish prank. I don't know guns, but I figured this guy did, so I tried calling this kid's bluff and asked him something like, "You shouldn't point toys like that, sweetie. The cops might think it's real." The kid responds by cocking the gun, and it has this real metallic sound that sends this kind of shock of fear running through me. I didn't know of any toy guns that made such a realistic sound, and as if to illustrate that he wasn't joking around, the kid pointed the gun in the air and actually fired a shot that went right over my head. After my ears got done ringing, and I came to, I heard "Give me all the money" in the same monotone, emotionless way, and I didn't hesitate in doing what he asked. I put as much cash as I could onto the countertop, then watched him fill his backpack with it before he just walked out of the store. I think the thing that scared me so much about it was that the kid just didn't seem to realize the gravity of the situation. He definitely seemed like he had something missing about him, like he didn't understand that he could have actually killed someone over whatever dumb thing he wanted to buy with that money, be it video games or candy or whatever it was. At least a grown-up armed robber understands that a gun is just a means of getting what he wanted, and it's not a good idea to fire it or whatever, just in case they accidentally shoot someone in the face. I get the feeling that even if I'd even tried to resist or tell the kid no, he'd have just shot me because it's what he assumed he should do. It's almost surreal to me how the closest I've ever come to death is at the hands of a child, someone who should have been so innocent and carefree and full of love, but instead just felt nothing. I had a guy come into the 7-Eleven I was working at, and when I was ringing up the items he wanted, he started getting all fresh with me, saying stuff like, "You're real pretty," and "What time do you finish work?" I lied to him and told him I was on till 11 even though I was finishing at 6, which was only like an hour away. He said he'd come back then, and we could go out for a beer or something, but I advised him not to since my boyfriend would be coming to pick me up around then, and he really wouldn't like the idea of some random guy hitting on me. That didn't seem to bother the guy too much though, and he made some dumb comment about how he'd make my boyfriend see things his way or something. I just nodded like, "Yep, I'm sure you will," and I could see him getting kind of angry before he walked out of the store. It didn't bother me too much, as he was only going to come back to the store later on to find out I wasn't there, and by that time, I'd be safe at home and away from any pervy creepers. But then at 6, when my shift finished, I walked outside with my purse only to see a car door open about 20 or 30 feet away. I swear I just about felt my stomach tie into a knot when I saw the creeper step out. I did a straight up 180-degree turn on my heel and started walking back into the store, then just went right behind the counter and into the manager's office after telling my coworker, "Just say I'm on break." He seemed real confused for a second, but as I shut the door and listened right at the edge of it, it was maybe only 30 seconds at the most before I heard him say, "Oh, her? She's just on break. I'm sure she'll be out in a minute." Normally, I'd take the bus back home, but I knew I'd have to get an Uber if I wanted to make it home without being seriously harassed. So I called the Uber, waited for it to arrive, then tried to just walk out as fast as I could. I didn't see the guy in the store, and I asked my coworker real quick, "Are they waiting for me?" And the guy shook his head, still confused, but kind of getting the gist of what was actually happening. They asked if I wanted them to call the cops, and I shook my head, just gunning for my Uber as I pushed open the glass door. I didn't see the guy anywhere, and I was so set on getting into the Uber that I didn't look left or right as I walked out of the 7-Eleven, so I had basically no warning that the guy was about to grab my arm and jerk me back. He looked really, really angry as he growled, "You lied to me," then called me a bunch of names as I tried pulling away from him. Luckily, my Uber driver saw absolutely everything, and he stepped out of the driver's seat to be all like, "Hey, let her go or I'll call the cops." He did let me go, and just smiled at the Uber driver as he told me, "This isn't over. I don't like being lied to." I wish that was all bluster too, like he was trying to act hard just to save a little face, but he wasn't. And for the next 3 months, he made my life a living hell. He kept showing up outside of the 7-Eleven, to the point where I had to blow a ton of my wages on Ubers to and from work. Then there was the time he actually tried to follow me home, and I had to actually tell the Uber driver what was happening so he could drive into the city just to shake the guy's tail. I tipped that guy massively. Even though he initially refused to accept the payment for the ride, he insisted on canceling until I burst into tears and begged him to take the money and my tip. I couldn't make it someone else's problem. I couldn't have that on my mind as well as all the other stuff. I developed something of a relationship with that one specific Uber driver, and he became kind of a father figure who always accepted my ride requests whenever he was working and made sure that no one followed me home. He was also the guy that told me that I needed to get the cops involved. I thought that this guy was going to hurt me, that he knew people with the same mentality and that they only ever actually gave up when the law got involved. I didn't even know why I was surprised when I found out that the guy had a previous conviction for stalking, and he seemed to know the legal process like the back of his hand. He knew the process of getting the restraining order through the courts would take weeks at a minimum, and he'd come visit me in the 7-Eleven just to taunt me sometimes, and he'd only leave once I threatened to call the cops on him. That was just about the only thing that seemed to really get to him too, the fact that he'd been arrested and convicted over something like that before. I wanted to tell him that he was pathetic, that he'd never ever have a good normal woman all to himself, that he'd always be some deranged psycho who got off on terrorizing those who couldn't defend themselves. But I didn't. In fact, I was told by one of the cops I spoke to, "Do not antagonize this man under any circumstances. We don't know how far he'll push this if you make him angry. If it's possible, do not engage him whatsoever. So like I said, that was my life for like a whole 3 months, until the day finally came when my mom got the call from our family's attorney saying a judge had finally approved the restraining order. For those wondering, it took so long because this guy had no history of actual violence, and the whole arm-grabbing incident wasn't actually classed as an assault for whatever reason. The day it finally came through, though, he must have gotten some kind of notification of it because he just stopped showing up at the 7-Eleven. Seeing him waiting for me outside whenever I finished was such a regular occurrence that when he finally didn't show up, I actually cried with relief. I told Carl, the Uber driver, that I thought I was finally free, and we had a miniature kind of celebration on that final drive back to my house. He still picks me up from time to time, too, sometimes when I've been out drinking with my friends, and it's awesome to be reunited with him after such a sickening ordeal. I suppose half the reason I'm sharing this is to help other girls avoid going through the same thing I did. Don't hesitate to get the cops involved with something like a stalking issue. There are literally laws in place to help deal with things like that. But the big thing, don't ever show a soft side or seem like you're playing hard to get. If a guy shows you any unwanted attention, either completely ignore him or make it clear that you'll just call the cops. Heck, carry a stun gun or pepper spray if you're legally able to in your state, and just show that SOB that you're carrying so they leave you alone. I just don't want any other girl to go through what I went through because I honestly lost almost 4 months of my life to this guy's mental abuse. Last month I visited Japan again for an opening ceremony of a new hospital at Hokkaido. It was Chinese New Year and there were many visitors around, and there is a saying going, the more visitors, the more accidents. That night, right after the party, 2 patrons were sent to our hospital. Car accident. It was due to the roads being slippery. The car lost control and spun 40 meters across the road and smashed into a tour bus. Luckily, there were no tourists inside or around the bus at the time, but the bus driver had his lower body crushed where the car had smashed. The driver of the car was an old man heading to a wedding ceremony. Information from the police said that he stepped on the brake too suddenly, that the rear tire slipped. Very unfortunately, the car driver died immediately. Meanwhile, the bus driver was rushed to do an immediate operation. We needed to observe him and decide whether or not to do another operation some days later when he awoke. We found that the bus driver's family had not arrived, and we realized that he was living alone and had no family. The bus driver didn't wake for almost a week. The doctor decided to do another operation since time was limited and they couldn't wait for him to decide. We had to think the best for any patrons. The operation did not go well. From the doctor's information, the patient was bleeding badly during the operation and the health condition of him was not so good. The man died that evening, making it the 2nd death in our hospital. That night, when I went to tidy up the patient's room for the next day's use, I saw a person facing the wall, mumbling to the wall. I tried to go and ask him who he was, but I was stopped by a nurse whom had worked at the hospital for years. She pulled me over and told me never to speak to such people. I suddenly realized that the person I saw looked just like the injured bus driver. I may have just experienced the hospital's first ever ghost story.
My name is Daniel Roberts. I'm a 20-year-old man, and I live in a small town in Arizona with my single mother. This story happened a year ago. I worked at a post office, and it was lousy pay. But it was the only job I was able to get at the time. So one night, I was on my way home from work when I realized my gas was running low. So I drove to the nearest gas station and parked my car at the pump. And as soon as I went inside the store to pay for my gas, this woman walked up to me. She looked very young, about 18 years old. By the way she dressed, I could tell she was a goth. Her face is covered in black makeup and had long curly hair. She had on a long gothic coat, skinny jeans, and long black boots. Anyway, she was very nice at first by asking me about myself, like, what's your name? Where are you from? Where do you work at? You know, normal questions. After I answered all her questions, I said, it was very nice to meet you. You have a good night. And I thought that was it, so I paid for my gas and walked outside towards my car. Then the woman began following me to my car, and I turned around and said, do you need anything? And she said no, and came to tell me that I had a nice car. And I said thanks. I tried to be calm, even though at this point, I am freaked out. She walked back inside the store, so I finished pumping my gas into my car and got inside. I was about to drive off, but then I felt a little hungry and decided to grab a snack. Since I thought I was going to be quick, I left my car running with the doors unlocked. I walked inside the store, and while I was looking for a snack, I noticed the woman walked out of the store, and she was walking towards my car. And as soon as she saw me walk outside with her, she ran to my car and got into the front passenger seat of my car and locked the doors. I yelled at her to get the hell out of my car, but she didn't say anything and gave me an evil smile that creeped me out. Then she scooted over to the driver's seat and drove off. I immediately called 911 to report to them that my car was stolen. I told the police that my car has a GPS tracker and I can track down my car. So the police took me to where my car GPS was. We found my car. It was abandoned on the side of the road. It was vandalized and had writings on the seats saying, I will see you again, and I will kill you. Still to this day, they never found her, and I will always be traumatized for the rest of my life.
This disturbing story happened during the year of 2019. However, if you would like to animate it, you shall. It took place in the time of quarantine, when almost everything was shut down. I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio, but moved to Virginia because the countryside is more peaceful and doesn't have as many thugs. I worked as a night auditor in a hotel. I won't say the name due to safety reasons. My shifts were usually from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. One night after my shift, I went outside while it was still slightly dark when a tall, stocky man started walking towards me, cradling something in a blanket. I'd been trying to avoid as much human interaction as possible on account of the pandemic, and I am a single mother to 4 very young boys, my youngest being only 6 months old. I was already having a suspension of the man anyway, because who would randomly be standing outside of a hotel with a baby at 6 o'clock in the morning? I tried to hurry to my car before he could get to me, but he said, "Excuse me, ma'am, I need to go to your house to change my baby's diaper. He hasn't been changed since yesterday." Call me mean if you want to, but there was no way I was going to take him to my house. I had sympathy for the baby, but I had my own children's safety to worry about. I said, "Sir, I will unlock the hotel's public bathroom so you can use the diaper changing station in there." "No," he yelled. I then started sprinting to my car. Of course, he chased me. I locked the doors as soon as I got in, but when I started driving, the man jumped out in front of me. He moved once he realized that either he was going to get out of my way or get run over. The next night when I clocked in, I noticed a letter in my cubbyhole that read, "You little bitch, you're lucky that we were outside a building full of people. Just remember that next time, your luck might not be as fortunate." Under my desk was a fake baby doll, wrapped in some colored blanket that the man was cradling the night before. The realization showered me in fear. I showed my boss and told him that I didn't want to work a night job anymore, thinking that the man might be stalking me during the nights. A few days later, I found out how wrong I was. I was at home enjoying a peaceful day with my children when I got a creepy letter with no return address that read, "You think you got away? I followed you home from work. I know where you live. I know what you drive. I see you outside as you watch over your little blood bags while they're playing in the yard every evening. I know their names. I know what they look like. I know everywhere they go. Remember, I'm always watching." I kept receiving those sickening, disturbing letters for a long time. The police said that the man left no fingerprints on the letters, so there was nothing much they could do. I didn't let my children go outside much anymore. One morning, it was past midnight when I heard knocking on the door. I looked out the peephole to see the same man from the night at the hotel. I remained silent, thinking maybe he will think I'm not home until he said, "I've been here a lot longer than you think. I know you're right there, and all 4 of your blood bags are in there somewhere. Just wait until I get in there and put my hands on them." I ran upstairs, gathered my children, and locked them in a room with me. I called the police, and that's when I heard glass shattering from downstairs. The man was in the house now. He searched downstairs for what seemed like 20 minutes, then came upstairs, kicking every door and shouting. The shouting grew louder. He was right outside the room we were in. The commotion startled my 6-month-old, so he started whining and moaning. I brought him to my chest, trying to calm him. He was starting to quiet down until the man threw a heavy object at the door and shouted louder. My baby then threw his head back and let out a long and loud cry. The man started kicking the door until I finally heard the police sirens pulling in my driveway. The kicking stopped, and I heard footsteps running down the stairway. The police caught him as soon as he tried to call out the back window. They told me that he had been wanted for assault, harassment, and child abduction. That happened 2 years ago, and my oldest son, who is now 8 years old, has not been the same since. He acts scared to go outside. My other 3 sons are now 6, 4, and 2. However, they do not understand the situation like my oldest does, and I dread having to tell them, due to the trauma that it could bring them.
I love to drive, like hours-long drives to nowhere with no destination in mind. Just me, my music, and the road ahead of me. Living in Nebraska, I'd often take back roads or lonely highways cutting through the countryside to small towns and eventually cities, and I'd usually take these drives at night since they were less traffic to worry about. I've done it since I've had my license 4 or 5 years ago, and I've never once had any sort of issue, nor have I ever run into any trouble. That was until a few nights ago. For reference, I'm a relatively small 22-year-old female, and as I stated before, I often take these drives completely and utterly alone. They're a good way to clear my head when I'm stressed, upset, or overwhelmed, or for me to get a plan together to sort personal issues out. I've also done these long and lonely drives to get away from the toxicity of my household when I used to live with my parents as a means of coping with their alcoholism. Though now that I've moved out and am in a much better place mentally, I don't really have the urge to get in my car and just drive anymore. However, on the night that this event took place, I was feeling pretty overwhelmed, stressed, and anxious with a ton of personal issues I'd rather not get into. I felt restless and irritable around my boyfriend, couldn't focus on anything else, and decided I could take a drive to clear my head. My boyfriend was understanding and told me to be careful and to not be gone for too terribly long since it was getting pretty late. I agreed, gave him a kiss goodbye, and left. I drove around our city for about 30 minutes, but I was still feeling on edge about everything transpiring in my personal life, so I decided to drive further north down those familiar, dark, winding one-lane highways. I kept the car at a steady 65 miles per hour, taking the turns at a slower pace in case a deer jumped out around the bend, and was just admiring the vast empty darkness of the snow-capped fields and barren trees. It was honestly a bit creepy being all alone with no cars in sight, in seemingly the middle of nowhere. The few houses miles back from the road, lightless, and the dead cornfields withered away and covered in snow. It was like something out of a horror movie, and I half expected to see a ghost pop up in my rearview mirror or see someone clamber out from the patches of trees dotting the horizon. The only light came from the headlights, and even then I still strained to see through the inky darkness of the night. By now it was just after 11, and I told myself that once I made the familiar roundabout that would either take you to a small town or back up towards the city, I would head back to the city and home. That roundabout was still maybe 15 to 25 minutes away, but other than my imagination picturing the worst, I wasn't really all that concerned. I mean, I was by myself. I didn't have any other motorist to worry about, right? As I'm rounding around another bend, I notice a vehicle with its hazard lights maybe a quarter of a mile or something away from me. It was some sort of sedan, dark-colored, and was angled to where only part of it was on the shoulder while the rest was jutted out into the road. Like they had pulled over in a hurry but didn't quite manage to do that. The driver's side door was flung wide open, and as I slowed my vehicle down and angled it towards the opposite side of the road to pass, I could make out what looked like maybe blood on the open door. I didn't see anyone on the road or in the car, and I was the only motorist in sight. Cell phone reception is spotty at best in this part of the country, but more often than not, you couldn't get reception no matter how hard you prayed, which was definitely the case when I took a glance at my phone to see I hadn't had any service. So, a lone female on the road at night, pulling up near a vacant vehicle that looks like someone had been attacked on the inside, with no cell service. No, I'm no dummy. I've watched countless episodes of Investigation Discovery and Criminal Minds, and read far too many true crime books to know that this had bad and danger written all over it. But there was still a small part of me that worried something terrible had happened to whoever was in that vehicle, and I thought I needed help. These roads don't get a lot of traffic late at night, and temperatures were well below freezing. If someone were hurt or in trouble, there was no one and nothing else to help them but me. Still, I erred on the side of caution. I was still driving my car, though a bit more slowly, and as I approached the vehicle, I rolled down my window a bit, shut off the music, and called out, "Hey, anyone there? Are you okay?" I didn't hear a response. I worried they were passed out somewhere, but I wasn't about to get out and look for them. I told myself I'd call out one last time, and if I didn't hear anything, I would leave, and the moment there was reception, I'd call it in. And if I did hear someone, well, I had figured out my next course of action then. So again, I shut out, "Hey, what happened? Are you okay?" There was silence for a beat, and then I heard rustling in the shadows of the trees, followed by a gruff voice saying, "Yeah." I was relieved at first, and was about to say something in response, or possibly even stop my car and get out, when I noticed three things nearly simultaneously. As I inched my way past the front of the sedan, I noticed that there was no damage to the hood anywhere else in the vehicle, which I found to be strange considering the blood on the inside of the door. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glance of someone coming out from behind the sedan, and they were making their way towards my car, fast. The person did not have any blood on them or appeared injured in any way, wearing a mask. Not like a face mask from the pandemic or a ski mask or anything normal, but one of those masks you could see in the Purge movies, and they were holding something in their hand. I don't know what it was. I couldn't get a look, but from its length and shape, my guess was maybe a tire iron or a crowbar or something. I don't need to tell you that I slammed on the gas the moment I noticed those things and drove like a maniac out of there. My heart thundering in my chest and my entire body shaking. My window was still rolled down in my haste and the music was still shut off, so I could very clearly hear someone, definitely a man, shouting at me, though I had no clue what they were saying. I just knew I had to get out of there immediately. I stole one last look in my rearview mirror as I drove away, mostly to see if they were getting in their sedan to follow chase or if they had stopped. The man with the weapon was still standing in the middle of the road watching me. And right before I looked away from the mirror, I saw a second man, also wearing one of those creepy masks, and no trace of blood on him. I probably broke every law for speeding that night, but I wanted to get as far away from those men as possible. As soon as I made it to the roundabout, I turned towards town, parked in the Walmart parking lot that thankfully still had cars from who I assumed were workers closing up shop, and proceeded to have a full-on meltdown. When I could pull myself together, I called one of my friends, T, who was a police officer, to tell him what happened and what I should do. He was concerned for me, and after asking if I was okay, where I was, did they follow me, etc., he told me since it was out of city limits, he couldn't do much on his end, but he could get in contact with the local police sheriff in that jurisdiction to take my statement and check it out. I agreed, thanked him, and while I waited for police to show up, I called my boyfriend. Through my hysterical sobs and panic, I managed to tell him what happened not even 10 or so minutes ago. He was, as you can imagine, super freaked out for my safety and wanted me to either come home immediately or drive down himself to take me home. I told him the police were on their way to take my statement, so I couldn't leave and that I was okay, but I stayed on the phone with him until I saw the familiar police cruisers pulling into the lot. I gave the police my statement and they assured me that they would go back to the spot. I told them that the sedan had been to take a look and they would try to catch the guys who did it. Though with no cameras and no description of the men, I wasn't sure what they'd be able to do. I didn't even get the license plate number, though at the time of my panic, the thought never came to mind until the police were asking if I got it. All they had to go off of was a dark-colored sedan and 2 guys with masks. After I gave my statement, I went home and stayed curled up close to my boyfriend the whole night, listening to every sound the house made in fear that it would be those guys arriving any minute to finish whatever it was they started. Since the incident, I haven't heard back from the police about whether or not they had any leads, and I'm not sure if they ever will. I'm just thankful I'm still here and that I didn't stop my car or get out. I'm not sure what would have become of me if I had. I still had so many questions that have no answers. What were they doing? Why? Was that blood on the inside of the car, or just a ruse to get more attention? If it was really blood, did they hurt someone else? What would have happened to me if I had stopped my car? Needless to say, I won't be going on any more late-night drives to anywhere, and I hope I never cross paths with those freaks again. This is Blanche Monnier. Born on the 1st of March 1849 into a wealthy French merchant family from the city of Poitiers, Blanche was famed for her striking beauty and delicate manner. Naturally, this attracted a great number of potential suitors, some from prominent positions in high society. But Blanche didn't want to marry for money or prestige, and she especially didn't want to spend the rest of her natural life with some beastly brute she barely knew. No, Blanche was in love. Around the age of 25, she had met a lawyer almost 10 years her senior. Despite his practice being a small and modest affair, Blanche was smitten with him. She didn't care if he didn't have the treasury or titles of some of her other potential husbands. She loved him for the nurturing, caring person he was. Yet in 1874, upon finally expressing her desire to marry the man, Blanche discovered her mother's reaction not to be one of joy, but one of disdain and disgust. "No daughter of mine is going to marry some penniless lawyer," Louise Monnier is thought to have said. "You'll wed whomsoever your father and I choose." But Blanche was defiant. She told her mother that she was free to marry whoever she pleased. She wasn't an object to be traded to boost the Monniers' esteem, and if her mother insisted on behaving in such a ghastly manner, she'd have no choice but to elope with her law-practicing lover. That night, once all were asleep, Blanche packed a small traveling case with only a handful of her most precious possessions and attempted her escape. Yet when she reached the bottom of the staircase, she heard a shrill voice pierce the darkness behind her. going somewhere? It was her mother. Louise had been watching and waiting to apprehend her daughter's attempt to fly the nest, and it turned out she had a rather draconian punishment in mind. What happened remained a closely guarded family secret for the next 27 years, and when the public came to learn of Blanche Monier's fate, they were horrified by what they heard. To most who know her, Blanche was there one day and gone the next. The sprightly young woman seemed to have just dropped off the face of the earth. Blanche's uncle Marcel, when questioned as to what happened to Blanche, would give the same story as her mother. She ran away, said she was going to live with that lawyer of hers. We miss her terribly, and we wish she'd come home. But this lawyer insisted he had not seen his beloved Blanche since the day she'd requested to marry him, and placed the blame for her disappearance squarely at the feet of the Monnier family. Her disappearance caused such a concern that a representative of the Poitiers magistrate visited the home to verify Louise Monnier's story. There, they were shown how her armoire had been emptied of clothing, along with a note purported to be written by Blanche herself that referred to eloping with my beloved. This seemed to have satisfied the authorities, and the blame once again shifted to Blanche's paramour. And although he was never formally charged in connection with her disappearance, he insisted on his innocence until his sudden death in 1885. In the years that followed, Blanche was slowly forgotten about as the world moved on without her. Just another victim of class and circumstance in a culture that sees its daughters as little more than property. Then, on May 23rd of 1901, a high-ranking government official in Paris received a frighteningly intriguing letter from an anonymous author. The envelope that was simply marked with the French words, "For Mr. Attorney General," the letter reads as follows: "Dear Sir, it is with the great sorrow that I must inform you of an exceptionally serious occurrence. I speak of a spinster who is locked up in Madame Monnier's house in Poitiers, half-starved and living in a putrid litter for the past 25 years, in a word, in her own filth. She is in dire need of assistance, as I fear her health to be in a grave condition. Please help her. Yours." It reads as if whoever had written the letter was just about to sign their name, then decided against it at the last moment. And maybe this is a sign that Madame Monnier's power and influence reach far beyond the regional government of Poitiers. Regardless of her high status, Madame Louise Monnier soon had her lavish home swarmed by French gendarmerie policemen. She demanded to know why they were there, yet the commanding officer simply ignored her, instructing his men to thoroughly search the cellars and attic spaces of the large house. It was then that Madame Monnier realized why they were there, but there was no mad dash to escape, no attempt to hide her crimes. By then, the damage had been done. While searching the attic of the house, police found a small, locked door that they were unable to gain entry to. They demanded that Madame Monnier produce the key, but she told them that she'd misplaced it sometime prior to their unexpected visit. This was of no import to the gendarmerie, who promptly smashed the door off its hinges before squeezing their way into the tiny room of the other side. The sight that greeted them elicited terrified gasps and exclamations from the policemen. They were gendarmerie, military policemen, trained to combat hordes of rioters on the streets of France. They were hard men, ready for anything, but nothing could have prepared them for what waited for them on the other side of that attic door. And this is what they saw. The woman they found had evidently been imprisoned in what can only be described as harrowing conditions. She was weak, on the verge of death, weighing little more than 55 pounds by the time she was rescued. Confined to a small, filthy mattress, the woman was surrounded by pieces of rotten food, pails of urine and stale water, and piles of her own excrement. The carpet and sheets were positively alive with a nightmarish array of parasitic insects, fat from feeding off of the fragile form of the imprisoned woman. One officer described the stench inside the room as unbreathable, and the officers were forced to return with masks in order to continue their grim work. Yet the most shocking discovery of all came when the emaciated woman was asked her name. Officers were so shocked that they asked her to repeat it. "My name," she said, struggling for breath, is Blanche Monnier. Blanche wasn't dead. Her mother hadn't had her killed as punishment for her escape attempt. Instead, she had been kept prisoner in a small windowless room for almost 30 years. Blanche was rushed to the hospital following her discovery, and while it's certain that doctors managed to save her life, she was never quite the same. She continued to suffer from a number of mental health problems and struggled to adjust to her newfound freedom. Doctors diagnosed her with a variety of debilitating physical conditions, but it has to be mental scarring which Blanche suffered that proves to be the most debilitating. Psychiatrists declared that Blanche showed signs of anorexia nervosa, schizophrenia, exhibitionism, and coprophilia. Her anorexia is somewhat easily explained by the severe food restrictions placed on her, while the devastating isolation she suffered can explain the schizophrenia. But somehow the exhibitionism hits harder than the former pair, because it shows Blanche was so desocialized and damaged by her isolation that she'd forgotten why she had to wear clothes. Nudity wasn't taboo for her anymore, as if she'd somehow become feral as a result of her suffering. The exhibition of coprophilic symptoms are also enough to make even the toughest of us shudder, as the idea of a person driven so mad by hunger that they'd eat their own excrement is perhaps one of the most horrifying concepts imaginable. These severe mental health conditions led to Blanche being admitted to a psychiatric hospital in the central French city of Blois, where she'd eventually died alone and in obscurity in 1913 at the age of 64. Blanche's mother, on the other hand, managed to escape the swift and unforgiving justice she so richly deserved. Shortly after her arrest, she became terribly ill, and a French judge was forced to allow her to remain on house arrest instead of being interred at the city jail. Just 15 days later, after the news of her crimes had circulated among the Pontier peasantry, an angry mob began to gather outside of the Monnier home. It's then that Madame Monnier, upon learning of the vengeful mob, died suddenly as a result of some previously unknown illness. But between you and me, I think it's all too much of a coincidence that Madame Monnier just so happened to pass away in the face of imminent danger, and it's more likely that she took the coward's way out. It was more bad news in the case of her uncle, Marcel Monnier, who, despite being initially convicted of kidnapping and false imprisonment, was later acquitted on appeal. Bizarrely, a judge suddenly found Marcel to be mentally incapacitated, and that a duty to rescue was not a statute in the French Penal Code. Therefore, Marcel lacked sufficient grounds to be convicted and was set free. As horrifying though as Blanche's story was, it was almost lost to history for a time before 1930, when French author André Gide published a novel based on the incident. Interest in the case was reignited, and the French people were once again horrified by the story of a mother who was soulless enough to inflict unimaginable cruelty upon her own flesh and blood. Louise Monnier had intended to lock her daughter away from the world until people forgot she even existed. But history has a way of bringing to light what is done in the dark. So now all should know of Blanche Monnier, or as she is known by the French in the early 20th century, La Séquestrée des Pontiers, the confined woman of Pontier. Take a look at this picture. What is it you see? Is it a doodle? Something someone scribbled absent-mindedly one day whilst talking on the phone? To the untrained eye, what's scribbled on this piece of paper might well appear to be gibberish, but to the improbable few of us that recognized old German cursive handwriting, they might well be able to make out the two words that constitute the entirety of that wall of text: Herzenschatzi and Komm. As it turns out, what you're looking at was intended to be a letter written by a woman named Emma Hoch and addressed to her absent husband. Born in Ellwangen in Germany in August of 1878, Emma was admitted to the psychiatric hospital at the University of Heidelberg after being diagnosed with dementia praecox at the age of just 30 years old. While a patient at the secure facility, Emma wrote a series of highly disturbing and upsetting letters to her husband, often consisting of just a few words repeated over and over again. In the letter you're looking at, she has written the words, Herzen Schotzi kom, meaning, darling, please come, and then kom, repeated over and over. It's thought that these phrases have been repeated almost 1,000 times on the small piece of paper, and that Emma's husband was extremely upset upon reading the letter, as it was clear that her condition hadn't improved in the least bit since her admission. Emma died on April 1st of 1920, and the hospital staff decided to store her many letters in a rather special place indeed. You see, the University of Heidelberg, where Emma received her treatment, has an entire department dedicated to the artwork produced by its psychiatric patients, known as the Prinzhorn Collection. It's here that Emma's letters were filed away and forgotten about for 80 years, when the Prinzhorn Collection put on an outsider art exhibit in Manhattan, New York City. Once a source of horror and heartbreak for those that knew her, this new generation of artists were fascinated by such candid representations of mental illness. They became the subject of a number of documentary films and were even adapted into a theater play around 2019. Such creative types have managed to put all kinds of spin and interpretation onto Emma's letters, claiming the pieces say more about the person viewing them than they do about Emma herself. But anyone who knows the backstory of such a picture knows that all it speaks is the immense loneliness and suffering of a person who didn't understand what was wrong with her. A person whose sole wish was to be reunited with the man she loved, a man who barely even recognized her anymore, neither physically nor mentally. May she rest in peace. On December 10th of 1945, homicide detectives burst into the home of Frances Brown, a murder victim who'd been gruesomely slain in her own Chicago apartment. She was discovered with a knife lodged in her neck and a bullet wound to the head, having been dead for a long time before she was found. Nothing seemed to have been taken from her apartment, but it was evident that Frances's killer had left something behind. A message scrawled on the wall of her apartment in her own lipstick, and this is what it said. For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself. In the course of the investigation that followed, police found a bloody fingerprint smudge on the door jamb of the entrance door. They also interviewed a witness who claimed to have heard gunshots at around 4 o'clock in the morning, as well as talking to the building's night clerk, who said a large, nervous man of about 35 to 40 years old got off the elevator and left the building shortly after the shots were fired. This information led them to 17-year-old William Herons. On June 26, 1946, 17-year-old William Herons was arrested for attempted burglary. Although insistent of his innocence, Herons would make 2 full confessions to 3 separate murders, including that of Frances Brown. On September 4th, Herons admitted his guilt on burglary and murder charges, then tried to hang himself in a prison cell. This wildly contradicts Herons' original statements that he was only going to confess to the murders in order to save himself from the electric chair. Why take the years to save your skin, then try to take your own life immediately after pleading guilty? It's entirely possible that Herons simply realized he couldn't do the time and tried to escape an unjust punishment. It's more likely that the despair of knowing he was caught had set in, and with one of his victims being a 6-year-old child, he knew his imprisonment would be rough, to say the least. In light of Herons' repeated claims of his innocence, no true motive has ever been established for the murders. But the photograph we're looking at may well provide a terrifying insight into Herons' mentality at the time of the killings. Maybe some people really are just consumed with the urge to kill, and maybe it's a craving as tangible as regular people's need for love, friendship, fulfillment, and satisfaction. Maybe for people like William Herons, killing is the only way they can achieve any kind of emotional release. And what's particularly horrifying about his case is that it seems he was completely self-aware of his nightmarish predicament. He wanted to stop killing. He just couldn't control himself. I was almost 30 and female, and I have been told I look 16 to 18 depending on the outfit. I have an anxiety disorder, and additionally, I have issues picking up social cues, so sometimes I misunderstand things, or get paranoid about things that are really innocent, so I've learned to question my thoughts. I've been working in the food service industry for a few years, and in particular about 2 years at the Burger King this happened in. This incident happened about 4 years ago now. I had just started working some late night shifts, and we hired a new manager, Paul. He was a foot or so taller than me, skinny, with dark eyes, and usually wore large glasses. He wasn't physically imposing, but still made me nervous because he was new and male. There are reasons new males put me on edge, but that's for another day. After a few days, I noticed some strange things. Whenever I worked the counter, he would stand so close behind me that I could feel the cloth of his shirt brush my neck because he was looking over my shoulder. Again, I worked here before he did and had for a year, so it bugged me. If I was stuck in the drive-thru area instead, he would stand in such a way that I was blocked in and couldn't get past him, and every time I bent over, if I looked up, I could tell that he was staring right at me. At first I figured I was just imagining it, that he wasn't purposely blocking me in. I had to be just paranoid again, I assumed. After a few more weeks of working there, he started buying pizza for the crew, or drinks, etc. for a nearby business, and he always was the one to go pick it up and bring it in. I wouldn't eat anything unless the rest of the crew did, and I never drank anything I didn't get for myself, nor did I leave anything in the back office just in case, because I just felt something was wrong. I kept telling myself it's overreacting, you're fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling. One night I was told I had to do a late night shift. Just me, Paul, and Jack, someone that has worked there for a long time, and I trust him implicitly. Before the others left, I asked Jack to please keep an eye on Paul because he scared me. That night Paul asked me to clean the bathrooms, and I had no choice but to agree. To illustrate the layout to the bathrooms of the building, in order to get to the bathrooms from the main office, you go by the kitchen, around the corner, through a door, into an entryway. From there, you open the men's room door, and from there is a back wall stall with a door. That's the stall I was in. So I'm there in the main men's stall, and Jack is in the kitchen as far as I know, with Paul in the office. As my back is turned, I hear the propped open men's room door shut. I turn around, and blocking my exit to the men's stall is Paul. Immediately I panic because that means that's 3 closed doors between me and Jack. Paul holds up a pair of drive-thru headgear and makes a comment like, "So I found these new ones in the office. Want to use them? I probably shouldn't give them to you, but I like you, so I figured why not?" I declined, and honestly I was shaking out of my shoes. Innocent as the dialogue was, he was looking me up and down the whole time, and it just felt creepy. He stood there about a foot away and just stared at me, not saying anything. And after a minute or so, Jack came in and said that there was a phone call and Paul had to come get it. Naturally, I booked it out of the bathroom and stuck myself to Jack, explaining that I was really scared and felt uncomfortable with the way Paul looked at me and the odd way he was behaving. Well, to me it was odd anyway, but again, I felt like I was probably being paranoid. He told me he wouldn't let me out of his sight the rest of the night and that he was sorry that he had been distracted. He didn't like Paul either, and he kept good on his word. A few hours later, Paul says he's grabbing pizza and some soda from the place I mentioned earlier. When he came back, he called me to the back office and offered me a glass of soda, pre-poured. I said no thanks, I'm fine. Thinking to myself to the time that I'm being overly stupidly paranoid, but then again, why did he always bring soda? We had over 100 kinds on the premises. He asked me another 2 to 3 times if I was sure, and I again declined, Jack right beside me. Then Paul asked me if I had a boyfriend. I did, but I lied and said fiancé because I figured it maybe dissuaded any potential flirting. He says, "Fiancé? Aren't you a little young for that?" I don't know why, but I told him my age. He just kind of sat there and looked me up and down really slow. "Oh, I thought you were 16 or 17. From there, he left me pretty much alone. Believe it or not, 3 days later he was arrested because the place he worked for before, he had inappropriately touched an underage female coworker, threatened them, and told them he was a cop and so on and would arrest them if they told. Eventually, he was transferred from there to where I work, and we were never told anything till his arrest. He comes by twice since then, even though he's not allowed on the property because we have minors on site. I'm still freaked out, especially because the last time he came around, he came through the drive-thru where I was standing. So to Paul, I hope I never see you again, and you get exactly what you deserve. For a little backstory, the legal drinking age in my country is 18, so if you want alcohol and didn't have a fake ID or a parent to get it for you, then you had to wait outside of the off license, which is like a liquor store for the Americans, until someone came by who agreed to go in and purchase the alcohol for you. So we waited around, found someone who was willing to go in and buy our alcohol for us, and got him to purchase a few bottles of vodka for me and a few friends, two of which I was with. Now, as it was around 6 p.m., we decided it was too much of a risk to decant our vodka into a less suspicious-looking bottle in the middle of the street, as it was very busy, so we did what we would usually do in this situation and found a nearby food place to quickly run in and use the bathroom to decant our alcohol so we could be on our merry way. This time we chose to do this in a nearby McDonald's. We'd done it in before, so we knew it was a safe bet. So we go into the McDonald's and head straight for the bathroom, as we'd done a million times before. As we get into the bathroom, me and my other two friends, we'll call them Harriet and Kara, all occupy one cubicle to get the job done and get out and back to our drinking ASAP. And as I previously mentioned, we'd done this lots of times before and usually opted to come into this McDonald's as it was usually busy, which meant no one paid attention to three teenagers running straight to the toilet without purchasing anything. So anyway, we're all in there doing our thing when I could suddenly hear a lot of shifting and moving above us. I figured it was possibly the air conditioning and opted not to tell my friends as I thought it would freak them out. We get the job done, and as we're about to leave the cubicle, we hear a giggle and a, "Where are you girls off to?" I looked up and see the forehead and eyes of a male who looked to be about 30, just staring out from underneath the tile in the ceiling that he'd slightly lifted. We're all in shock, just staring at this guy who proceeded to giggle down at us and ask our names, where we were going to, and if he could come. We're all in shock because, let's be honest, who really expects there to be some random guy in the ceiling of a McDonald's? Being a teenager who thought I was untouchable, I proceeded to tell the guy that he was a perv and to F right off. The guy seemed to enjoy this and giggled a little more, still shifting around in the ceiling, never taking his eyes off of us. Now, I should probably mention that along with pouring our drinks into other bottles, we pre-rolled a few joints, so we were scared to alert anyone at this point, as we were young and terrified of our parents finding out. The guy still staring at us proceeds to ask questions like, "What age are you guys? Where do you live? Can I have some of your drink and smoke of your weed?" Still all the while twitching and fidgeting overhead. He then started to lift the tile, and as we're all stuck in a cubicle with this guy above us, we knew the only way for him to get down was to come down directly on top of us. So we got out of there at that point pretty quickly. We went outside and discussed what we were going to do, and I decided to go back in and alert someone, as it's a very busy McDonald's, and I knew that there would be women and children in and out of the toilet until closing time. I didn't want to risk that creep staying up there just to spy on them, especially since I knew he was there and had witnessed his behavior firsthand. So I go in, tell a member of staff that I'd been in the toilet for a long while talking on a phone call. Terrible lie, but my 15 to 16-year-old brain was too scared to tell the truth in case they alerted the police. And that's when the guy had appeared, and to my shock, they were completely unsurprised. They were just angry more than anything. I've seen a few male members of staff enter the toilet, and I figured they could handle it from there, so I went on my way. We still went into that McDonald's, but never had any encounters with that bathroom fairy, or not even sure if the guy got caught, as we didn't hear anything about it afterwards. So a few days after my 19th birthday, a few of my buddies and I are rolling around town in one of our cars, passing bottles and generally getting up to no good. We find a spot to park up, have a few smokes and blast some music, hanging out and just messing around until long after the sunset. Eventually, once we get hungry enough, we decided to drive over to Burger King to get a bite to eat. Now, I'm pretty lit by that point, and I've been lying if I said I wasn't generally being a complete jerk here, but here goes. So the Burger King drive-thru is closed for some reason, so we park the car up, get out, and head into the restaurant. And at the head of this huge line was this giant ham beast who was in the middle of waving her arm flab around, making some animated complaint about her order. My drunk buddies and I proceeded to watch this ham beast making an absolute idiot out of herself for like 10 minutes straight, holding up the entire line until eventually she steps to the side to wait for her corrected order or whatever. Either way, the line starts to move again. Everyone is super livid at this hog lady for holding up the line, and I could tell the workers behind the counter were less than pleased with her too. So by the time I get to the front to give my order, I'm feeling all cocky and righteous, and for some reason I had it in my head that if I made the workers laugh by roasting the hog lady, I'd get like a free meal out of it or something. So I say something to the effect of, "May I apologize on behalf of humanity for the irate snuffling of my heavy friend here." No one laughs. They all just look pretty shocked, looking back and forth between the ham beast and myself, waiting for the aftermath. She turns red in the face and I expect her to explode on me. I'm ready for the black eye or whatever. It was worth it just to hear my buddies cracking up behind me. But she didn't flip her lid. She didn't say a word. She just sort of stood there, steaming mad until the guy behind the counter appeared with her amended food order. Then she just sits down and starts eating her food. We get our food and sit down on the opposite side of the restaurant, and all the while my buddies are like, "Come on, man, you burned her, jeez, dude." But I'm looking over at her, because the ham beast is on her phone, just talking all quiet, but every so often she shoots us a little bit of a look with this big smug grin on her fat face. I don't know what I was expecting to happen, but why I thought I'd get away with it, I have no idea. Because the moment we walked out of that restaurant, we just hear from behind us, "There he is. That one, right there." I look around, and she's pointing at me, the same smug grin on her face. Then, when I turn back, there's a gun in my face. I honestly can't remember what the dude was screaming at me, only that he was, but I know it was her husband. It's weird the little details you notice when something like that happens to you. I distinctly remember seeing the dude's wedding ring on a finger that was wrapped around the handle of the pistol. I'm not a gun guy, but that thing was an incredibly big pistol, like huge. And all I did was sort of zone out and look down the barrel for a few moments with this guy's screams ringing in my ears. It was only when he pushed it to my forehead that reality came back to me and hit me like a ton of bricks. I just remember shaking so hard that when the guy told me to get down on my knees, I could barely react. He screamed at me to get on my knees because I didn't deserve to die on my feet, and that line stuck with me even to this day. I've never been so scared in my entire life. If you notice, I haven't given my name or where this happened or when it happened. This is to give me enough anonymity to admit that just after I fell to my knees, and I mean fell to my knees, I just straight urinated my pants, which I didn't even know was really a thing. I mean, obviously I've heard about people being so scared they wet themselves, but I didn't think it could actually happen to people. But I suppose since I was full of booze and that large Coke, there was plenty in my bladder to void, and void my bladder I did. Somehow, I had found a way to make a terrible situation even worse. Not only did I think I was about to die in a parking lot, while a whole restaurant full of strangers looked on in horror, I was about to die soaked in my own urine, cowering and shaking, on my knees outside of a freaking Burger King. He starts shouting other stuff at this point too, but I can't quite remember that either. I was just waiting for the moment my light switched off, a feeling like I'd fallen asleep real fast that I'd never, ever wake up from. I remember trying to shout something myself, something about how, will someone please call the cops, or whatever, but fear is a powerful thing. I couldn't speak. I mean, it was like a nightmare come to life. One of those where you try to scream for help, but your voice just sort of dries up in your throat. The next thing I remember are my ears pricking up to the word cops being spoken by some bystander just out of my view. Then I hear the distinct voice of the ham beast repeating the word, only this time, it's not me that sounds scared, it's her. I feel the tip of the pistol leave my head, and by the time I summon the courage to look around again, I see the pair of them, ham beast and gun guy, screeching out of the parking lot in some battered old sedan, followed swiftly by the blaring sirens in the distance. It was only when I was giving my statement to the cops that I noticed my buddies were gone. And not only were they completely out of sight, so was the car. So I had to be driven home to my parents' house in a freaking cop car, which clued them into the fact that I had been drinking, which to them was far more worthy of their attention to the fact I'd almost just been shot in the Burger King parking lot. They tried to ground me for like a month, but they didn't need to enforce it. I was too shaken up to leave the house for the first week entirely. Just be careful who you're talking to or trying to be funny. You never know who's psycho enough to put a gun to your head.
So I recently went on a trip with my family to Japan. Overall, I really enjoyed myself and thought it was a beautiful country. But one thing happened to me that kind of puts me off. I decided I was hungry. Seeing a 7-Eleven out my hotel window, I decided to go and get something to eat because it wasn't too much of a walk and there was no room service or anything. So I set off on my small journey to get some food. After buying some kebab things and a strange cake, I went to the small seating area to sit and eat because I was too tired to walk back yet. It was just me and an older Japanese man sitting behind me. I felt someone touching my hair. I turned around. He started trying to tell me how beautiful my hair was, but his English was terrible, so I just smiled and said, "Thank you." This was not uncommon, as I have strawberry blonde hair, and a lot of people in Japan seem to be fascinated with it. People always come up and touched it. I got back to eating, but soon after, the man moved next to me and started trying to talk to me again. To be completely honest, I sort of felt obliged to try and communicate because he seemed so cute and old and innocent. I just wanted to be nice. Bad idea. Shortly after, he starts saying short phrases in English. Incredibly sexual short phrases. His English seemed to have gotten better, and he continued to ask me for sex and tell me I was beautiful, and I was very uncomfortable at this point and got up and left the 7-Eleven. At this point, he decided it would be really cool and a fun idea to come with me. At this point, I just couldn't deal with his. I wanted to go back to the hotel and nap. I turned around and began cursing, telling him to leave me alone now. All of a sudden, he got this very angry look on his face and actually spat on me. I was so furious at this point that I turned around, ignored the pain in my stomach, and walked home so angrily I probably looked like a cartoon character.
A few months back, I decided I was pretty much over the breakup I'd had during the summer with my long-term girlfriend. It took me months to be able to get over it, as I was really heartbroken, but at some point you just sort of have to get back on the horse, don't you? So I downloaded that dating app Hinge and started swiping through profiles. It's definitely the best dating app I've come across, as it lets you actually message girls directly instead of just sort of hoping that they're going to see you and match with you. So it definitely gave me a better chance at getting to talk to the kind of girls I'm into, and and one of these was a Persian girl named Sarushe. Sarushe was honestly one of the most beautiful girls I'd ever laid eyes on. She had this big mess of wild dark hair that was dip-dyed blonde towards the ends, really high cheekbones, perfectly sculptured eyebrows, and some of the deepest, darkest, most alluring brown eyes I'd ever seen. She was simply stunning, and because she'd grown up in Tehran, the capital of Iran, I had something of an edge. You see, I speak a little bit of Farsi, the language they speak there, and I figured that might impress her if I told her as much, which it did, and boom. Only an hour or so later, I sent her my opener and we were chatting. She was an extremely busy person, and I was flattered when she said that she would make time to see me. So, we arranged to meet for coffee over the weekend. She showed up to our date in her gym gear and apologized for being so underdressed, but could only make it after a scheduled workout with her personal trainer. But I didn't care at all. She looked absolutely smoking hot in her yoga pants. And we were having coffee, just kind of chatting about our lives, our interests, all that first date kind of stuff, when I look out of the big glass windows to see this dude leaning up against his car. I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me at first, but after a minute or two I realized that he was just straight up staring at us. At one point, Sarushe noticed me looking over her shoulder and asked what I'm looking at, and I make a comment about the bloke outside who seemed to be proper eyeballing us. She then turns around, looking over her shoulder, then spins back with this terrified look on her face before saying something like, we have to leave, now. I'm all like, why? Do you know that fella? And she denies knowing him, but I'm not a dope. I knew what the score was, like straight away. Either it was a controlling family member or something, or it was a psycho ex-boyfriend. I figured all he'd do was follow us to try and be intimidating or something, but I never imagined he'd actually lay hands on me, and the way that he did it absolutely scared the soil out of me. You see, where I live is built up along this big mile-wide river, and the coffee shop me and Sarushe had chosen to meet at was right on the docks. So we're walking along the city's promenade when the guy cornered me, grabbed me by the throat, and started pushing me backwards so my back was leaning over the rails. I tried to get him off, but this bloke was an absolute unit, and as much as I tried, there was no getting him off of me. And the thing about the river where I live is that it's got a really, really strong current. Like if you fall off of a boat or over the side of the prom, you can be in serious trouble as the current will suck you under the water, drown you, and then just drag you out into the Irish Sea. So the whole time he's threatening me, telling me to leave Sarushe alone, all this big macho masculine stuff. Sarushe is smacking him around the head, telling him to get off me, and all the while I'm thinking, if I go over the edge here, I'm a dead man. And I don't think he had any idea of it either. Like it didn't sound like he was from our city, as we have a very particular accent, which he just didn't have. So he was probably thinking he could lash me in the water and embarrass me a wee bit, and I'd just be fine, but I'm telling you now, I wouldn't have been, and he'd have been done for manslaughter. But thank God, he didn't throw me over the railings, he just sort of backed off and headed back the way that he'd come after he'd blown off a little bit of steam. I mean, the girl was gorgeous. I don't blame him for being a bit sore after a breakup or jealous of another lad, but if he'd been angrier, if he'd have lost his cool, really lost control, I legit wouldn't be here typing this. I'd be floating in the Irish Sea somewhere, maybe washing up as a rotten corpse on the beach in County Cork, all because of some idiot getting a bit jealous. So before this whole lockdown thing happened and my dating life went to hell in a handbasket, I used to swipe through Tinder and Bumble quite a lot, looking for girls to hook up with. So I'm bored in my Silver Lake apartment one day when I come across this absolute smoke show of a girl who was listed under the name Lilith. She had these big green eyes, wore pigtails a lot in her profile pictures, and had absolutely no qualms of showing off this big peachy butt she had. She also had this goth girl vibe going, which was something I find really attractive. I mean, she was definitely not the kind of girl I'd bring home to mom, but that's not really what I'm looking for when I'm swiping, so naturally, I swipe right. Boom, we match. I think I actually let out this involuntary "no way" when the old "it's a match" text appeared, and kind of cynically told myself, nah, she's a bot, this isn't real. But yup, it was real, and she was so cute to talk to. At first, anyway, because things started to go a little different when we actually met up. She worked at this coffee shop at the Getty and asked me if I wanted to pick her up after her shift so she could take me somewhere real special, which turned out to be the Museum of Death on Hollywood Boulevard. I mean, not my ideally romantic place to go on a first date, but like I said, she was a slam piece, and it was basically impossible to say no to her. So it was decided, and after I picked her up, she kept it a mystery for a while, only telling me to drive her to Hollywood Boulevard before revealing where she actually wanted to go. The area around the museum is kind of sketchy, but again, I'd have driven through way worse neighborhoods for a date with this girl, so I just pushed all my concerns to the back of my mind. Despite the interior being as dark and dingy as it was, looking like an over-clustered basement, the whole thing was actually kind of interesting at first. But I'd be lying if I said my eyes stayed on the exhibits the whole time, when they were pretty much glued to her butt whenever I wasn't going to get caught looking. It most definitely wasn't particularly creepy either, but the things that Lilith started to say to me as we were walking around the place did in a big, bad way too. Like I said, the exhibits were interesting, but that's all they were aside from being gross and spooky. There were death masks, body parts preserved in formaldehyde, all the things you might come to expect from a place called the Museum of Death, and then some. But this Lilith chick starts saying how pretty some of this stuff is, looking at it the way any other girl might look at a picture of a puppy or something. She then starts asking me all these weird questions about how I'd like to die. Yeah, how I'd like to die. I tell her I wouldn't like to die at all. I mean, it was legit the creepiest question I think I'd ever been asked, and she insists that everyone has a way they'd most want to die. I don't want to screw up the date or anything. She seemed crazy, and crazy girls can be real fun, if you catch my meaning, so I give her some throwaway response like, whatever way is most pain-free. She starts telling me how that was a boring answer, and how she'd like to die of hypothermia because it apparently makes you feel all warm and sleepy towards the end. How some victims of hypothermia have even taken their clothes off before they died and just laid down in the snow or whatever before their heart stops beating. She also then gave me this long, in-depth speech about how taking another person's life would be better than even getting intimate, if you catch my drift. How that feeling of pure power must dwarf any feeling that drugs or alcohol have to offer. She then tells me how hot she thought it would be to watch me drown at the bottom of a pool while there's an audience, and how it'd actually turn her on to see my final moments of desperation before my body went limp and floated around the tank. Then something about how the Vikings would make wings out of the skin on a person's back by peeling it off and spreading it out, calling it beautiful, how it was like art or something. When she's done telling me all of that, and I'm suitably freaked out, she starts calling me pet, and how she wanted me chained up at the end of her bed so she could do whatever she wanted with me. Now, any other girl, I'd think that was incredibly kinky, but after what Lilith had just talked about, I really didn't think what she had in mind for me involved any kind of pleasure whatsoever. When it came to driving her home, she actually told me to stop a few blocks away from her house because she didn't want me to know exactly where it was that she lived at, saying that you couldn't be too careful these days with all the psychos in the world who use dating apps. Yep, she said that to me after she'd spent like an hour talking about all the ways she'd want to die or how she'd watch me die. As soon as I got home, I blocked her number. I've never been more scared of anyone like that before, let alone a girl I wanted to hook up with. So, Lilith, if you're reading this, let's not meet again.
Our official merch store is finally here. If you want to support more of our channel, check out our merch shop. The link is in the description down below. See you on the next video.